Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Myra Castellanos, and 6 months ago, I never would have believed that human memory could be stored in architecture. I was a cognitive neuroscientist specializing in memory formation, and I understood the brain's biological mechanisms with the kind of certainty that comes from 15 years of peer-reviewed research and grant-funded laboratory work. My dissertation had focused on the neurological patterns of false memory syndrome, the way the hippocampus could be convinced to encode events that never occurred through carefully controlled stimulation. I thought I understood the boundaries between the remembered and the real. I was wrong about so many things. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, when Seattle's perpetual gray had begun its slow transition into something approaching spring. I was in my office at the university, a cramped space on the 4th floor of the behavioral sciences, building that smelled of old coffee and the particular mustiness of academic journals that hadn't been opened in years. My latest grant application had been rejected 3 days prior, the third rejection in as many months, and I was staring at my dwindling research budget with the kind of numb acceptance that comes from understanding that your life's work might be ending not with revolutionary discovery, but with bureaucratic entropy. The subject line read, "Consultation opportunity, urgent competitive compensation." In academia, we learn to recognize spam, but something about the phrasing made me open it. The sender was listed as Dr. Raymond Voss, Director of Special Projects at a company called Meridian Cognitive Solutions. I'd never heard of them, which meant nothing. The cognitive sciences attracted venture capital the way rotting fruit attracts flies, and new companies appeared and dissolved with seasonal regularity. The body of the email was brief, almost aggressively so. Dr. Voss requested a meeting to discuss a consulting position involving memory research at a facility in eastern Washington. The compensation was listed as $15,000 for 2 weeks of work, with the possibility of extension. No details about the nature of the research, no information about the facility's location beyond approximately 3 hours from Seattle, and no explanation of why they'd chosen me specifically from the hundreds of memory researchers in the Pacific Northwest. I should have been suspicious. I should have researched Meridian Cognitive Solutions more thoroughly than the cursory web search that revealed nothing but a generic corporate website with stock photography of diverse professionals in lab coats looking thoughtfully at tablets. I should have asked more questions when I called the number provided, and reached an answering service that took my information and promised Dr. Voss would return my call within 24 hours. I should have recognized the red flags that my training had prepared me to identify in experimental protocols and institutional review board applications. But $15,000 was 3 months of my current salary, and my savings account had been depleting steadily as I paid for research expenses that my shrinking grants no longer cover. Financial desperation has a way of quieting the parts of your brain that recognize danger. That's not a metaphor. Actual neurological studies have demonstrated that economic stress impairs the prefrontal cortex's executive function, making us worse at long-term planning and risk assessment. I knew this academically, but knowledge doesn't immunize you against your own biology. Dr. Voss called the next afternoon. His voice had the careful, measured quality of someone accustomed to choosing words precisely. with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. German, maybe, or Dutch. He apologized for the vagueness of his initial email, explaining that the nature of the project required discretion and that he preferred to discuss details in person. When I pressed him, he offered only that Meridian Cognitive Solutions had acquired a property in eastern Washington that contained unusual architectural features that appeared to affect memory formation in measurable ways. They needed someone with my specific expertise in false memory syndrome to help them understand what they were observing. "What kind of architectural features?" I asked, my skepticism probably audible even through the phone connection. "Dr. Castellanos, I understand your hesitation," he said. "I would be skeptical too, but I promise you what we've found is worth your time. The effect is consistent, reproducible, and completely unprecedented in the literature. If you agree to visit for even one day, I'll pay your full consultation fee regardless of whether you decide to continue. And I'll send over our preliminary data before you arrive, so you can make an informed decision." The preliminary data arrived that evening as a password-protected PDF. Inside were 30 pages of documentation that read like bad science fiction, trying to masquerade as legitimate research. The facility in question was described as a residential treatment center, built in 1968 and abandoned in 1993, acquired by Meridian Cognitive Solutions 6 months ago through what the document vaguely termed asset liquidation proceedings. The building had apparently sat empty for over 30 years, maintained only by a skeleton crew of caretakers who ensured the structure didn't fall into complete disrepair. According to the documentation, Meridian's initial survey team had experienced what they termed spontaneous memory insertion events within the first week of beginning restoration work. Multiple team members reported detailed memories of events that had never occurred, always involving the facility itself. These weren't vague impressions or dreams. The document included sworn statements from construction workers, architects, and engineers describing specific memories of walking through hallways they'd never entered, having conversations with colleagues that had never happened, and experiencing entire shifts of work that timeline analysis proved they couldn't have performed. The document included neurological scans. PET imaging and fMRI data from affected individuals showed activation patterns consistent with genuine memory recall, not confabulation or delusion. The hippocampal and prefrontal cortex activity matched what you'd expect from someone accessing real episodic memories, not constructing false ones. But the memories were demonstrably false, corroborated by security footage, witness statements, and basic logical impossibility. One construction foreman described a detailed memory of installing electrical wiring in a section of the building's east wing. The memory included specific details: the smell of fresh coffee from a thermos, a conversation with his supervisor about his daughter's soccer tournament, the particular resistance of the vintage conduit as he fed new cables through it. Security footage showed he'd never entered that wing. His supervisor confirmed they'd never discussed his daughter's athletics. The thermos was later found in his truck, still sealed, coffee undrunk. But his neural activity while recalling the event showed all the markers of genuine memory formation. I read the document 3 times, each reading accompanied by a different emotion. The first time, disbelief. The second, skepticism tinged with curiosity. The third, the creeping recognition that if even a fraction of this was legitimate, it represented something that shouldn't be possible according to everything I understood about human cognition. Memory formation requires encoding. Experiences create neural patterns that are consolidated and stored through well-understood biochemical processes. You can't have memory without experience, not genuine memory with the full neural signature of lived events. What the document was describing was neurologically impossible, like claiming someone could have scars from injuries they'd never sustained, or tan lines from sun exposure that had never occurred. I called Dr. Voss the next morning and told him I'd visit for one day. He sounded pleased but not surprised, as if he'd known what my decision would be before I'd made it. We arranged for me to drive out the following Monday. He provided GPS coordinates rather than an address, which should have been another warning sign. But I was already mentally spending the consultation fee on new fMRI time and grant application fees. The drive from Seattle took 4 hours, not the 3 Dr. Voss had estimated. Interstate 90 carried me east through the Cascade Mountains, through Snoqualmie Pass where snow still clung to the peaks despite the advancing spring, and down into the high desert plateau of eastern Washington. The landscape transformed with each mile, from dense forest to bare rock to scrubland dotted with sage and rabbit brush. Cell coverage became intermittent after Ellensburg, then vanished entirely somewhere past the small town of Vantage. The GPS coordinates led me north from the interstate on increasingly deteriorating roads. Paved highway became cracked asphalt, became gravel, became dirt. I passed through what might charitably be called a town, a gas station with rusted pumps, a boarded-up diner, 3 houses with yards full of automotive detritus, and then into true emptiness. The high desert stretched in all directions, broken only by basalt formations that rose like frozen waves from the ancient lava flows that had created this landscape millions of years ago. I saw the facility before the GPS announced my arrival. It appeared on the horizon like a mirage, geometry imposed on geological chaos. 3 stories of concrete and glass, rectangular and institutional, completely at odds with the organic randomness of the surrounding terrain. As I drew closer, details emerged. Windows in a grid pattern, some broken and others merely dark. A flat roof with what looked like old ventilation equipment. A parking lot where wind-blown sand had begun the slow process of reclaiming asphalt for the desert. The parking lot held 6 vehicles when I arrived. 3 trucks that looked like they belonged to contractors, an SUV with government plates, a sedan that could have been a rental, and a pristine Mercedes that seemed as out of place as an orchid in a junkyard. I parked next to the Mercedes, collected my laptop bag and the portable EEG equipment I'd brought from my lab, and approached the building's main entrance. The entrance was glass doors beneath a concrete overhang, the kind of architectural feature that had been ubiquitous in institutional buildings of the 1960s. Someone had wedged one door open with a rubber stopper, allowing a parallelogram of sunlight to fall across the interior lobby. I stepped through, and the temperature dropped at least 15 degrees. The building's HVAC system was apparently functional, which seemed odd for a supposedly abandoned facility. The lobby was generic institutional space, tile floor, fluorescent lighting that flickered arrhythmically, walls that might once have been white but had aged to the color of old newspapers. A reception desk stood empty, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust that someone had recently disturbed with their hands or equipment. Behind the desk, a directory board listed departments: administration, patient services, residential units AED, physical therapy, occupational therapy, medical records. The letters were that particular orange-brown color, that vintage plastic, becomes after decades of fluorescent light exposure. Dr. Castellanos. The voice came from my left, where a hallway extended into the building's interior. A man emerged from the shadows, tall, perhaps 60, with the kind of fitness that comes from disciplined exercise rather than manual labor. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, an outfit carefully calculated to split the difference between professional and practical. "I'm Raymond Voss. Thank you for making the drive." His handshake was firm, his palms slightly cool. Up close, I could see the details that photographs wouldn't capture. The precision of his haircut, the expensive watch on his wrist, the barely perceptible hearing aid in his left ear. His accent was indeed German, I decided, but softened by decades of English immersion. "The facility is impressive," I said, which was a polite lie. The facility was unsettling in ways I was only beginning to register. The air tasted stale and slightly sweet, like flowers that had been dead for precisely one day too long. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The temperature wasn't consistently cool but varied in subtle ways, creating currents of cold air that brushed against my skin like invisible fingers. "It was a residential treatment center," Dr. Voss explained, gesturing for me to follow him down the hallway. "Built to house patients with developmental disabilities and severe psychiatric conditions. The philosophy at the time was to isolate such individuals from urban environments, to create controlled therapeutic settings far from the complications of city life. There were dozens of facilities like this across the western states in the 60s and 70s. Most were closed in the 80s and 90s, as treatment approaches changed and funding evaporated." We walked down the hallway, our footsteps echoing against tile floors that had once been polished, but now bore the scuff marks and stains of decades of use and abandonment. The walls were lined with doors, each with a small window at face height and a placard beside it listing room numbers. 3A through 3L on this corridor, which suggested I was on the third floor despite having entered at ground level. The building must have been built into a hillside, using the natural slope to create multiple ground-level entrances. "How many patients did it house?" I asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to fill the silence that felt too heavy, too expectant. "At capacity, 240, Dr. Voss said, though it never reached capacity. Records suggest the census averaged around 180 during the facility's operational period. The closure was gradual. Patients were transferred to other facilities or released into community care programs over several years. The last resident left in March of 1993, and the facility was mothballed pending sale or demolition. Neither occurred." We turned a corner, and the hallway opened into a larger space, a common area or day room, judging by the furniture that remained. Institutional couches in faded colors, their foam cushions compressed into permanent valleys by decades of bodies. A television mounted on a wall bracket, its screen dark and thick with dust. Tables with plastic chairs, some upright and others scattered across the floor as if abandoned mid-game. Windows along one wall looked out onto what might have been a courtyard, though the glass was so dirty that the view was reduced to shapes and shadows. "This is where the effect is strongest," Dr. Voss said, his voice dropping slightly. "The common areas, spaces where many people spent significant time, where routines were established and repeated. My hypothesis is that the architecture somehow records the patterns of human activity, the way magnetic tape records sound, and under certain conditions, it plays those recordings back." I wanted to laugh, but something about the space made laughter seem inappropriate. The room felt occupied despite being empty. Not haunted, I don't believe in ghosts, but somehow retaining an impression of the humans who had inhabited it. The air was warmer here, closer, carrying odors that shouldn't have survived 3 decades of abandonment. Institutional soap, the particular smell of overcooked vegetables, something medicinal and astringent that made my sinuses ache. "You're experiencing it now," Dr. Voss said, watching my face. "The sensory elements. Smell is the most common first manifestation, though some people report temperature changes or auditory phenomena. The full memory insertion usually requires longer exposure, between 30 minutes and 3 hours depending on individual susceptibility." "This is suggestion," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew I was wrong. The smells were too specific, too consistent with what institutional facilities of that era would have smelled like. I'd toured similar buildings during my graduate research, not abandoned ones, but functioning psychiatric hospitals and care facilities. The particular combination of industrial cleaning products, overcooked institutional food, and the slightly sweet smell of certain medications was distinctive and exact. "I thought the same," Dr. Voss admitted. "Initially, I believed we were dealing with mass suggestion, folie à plusieurs, some form of shared delusion triggered by the setting. But the neural data doesn't support that. The brain activity of affected individuals shows genuine memory consolidation, not the patterns we see in suggestion or hypnotic states. And the memories are too consistent, too detailed. Multiple people report the same events, the same conversations, even the same specific sensory details, without any prior communication or shared information." He gestured to a doorway leading off the common area. "The monitoring equipment is set up in what used to be the administrative offices. I'll show you the data, the neural scans, the interview transcripts. But first, I need to inform you of the risks." That got my attention. "What risks?" "Memories fade," Dr. Voss said, "usually within 72 hours of leaving the facility, but not always completely. Some residue remains, fragments that integrate into the person's genuine memory architecture. We've had team members report confusion about their actual past, difficulty distinguishing their real-life experiences from what they encountered here. Nothing permanent so far, nothing that hasn't resolved with time and distance. But the effect is real, and it can be disturbing." "Has anyone been hurt?" I asked. "Not physically," Dr. Voss said, which was not reassuring. "Psychologically, there's been distress, anxiety, confusion, some brief dissociative episodes. Everyone has recovered fully. But I need you to understand that exposure to this environment carries risks we don't completely understand yet." I should have left then. Every instinct trained by years of research ethics protocols screamed that this was precisely the kind of experimental scenario that required informed consent, institutional review, and multiple layers of safety monitoring. But I was already committed in ways I didn't fully acknowledge. The $15,000 was part of it, but not all. Curiosity has its own gravitational pull, especially for researchers who have spent their careers studying phenomena that suddenly seem pedestrian compared to what Dr. Voss was describing. "Show me the data," I said. The administrative offices occupied the building's northeast corner, a suite of rooms that must have housed the facility's business operations. Someone had converted them into a surprisingly sophisticated research station. Banks of computer monitors displayed real-time data feeds from sensors distributed throughout the building. Temperature, humidity, electromagnetic fields, even seismic activity. A medical examination table had been set up in one corner, surrounded by the kind of neural monitoring equipment that belonged in a university research hospital, not an abandoned facility in the high desert. The equipment alone represented several $1 million of investment, which said interesting things about Meridian Cognitive Solutions' funding and priorities. Dr. Voss spent the next 2 hours walking me through their documentation. The data was extensive and meticulously organized, far more thorough than the preliminary report he'd sent me. Video interviews with affected individuals, complete transcripts with timestamps, neural imaging showing activation patterns during memory recall, timeline analyses proving the logical impossibility of the remembered events, comparative data showing the consistency of details across multiple independent reports. One case study particularly captured my attention. A structural engineer named Patricia Kimball had spent 3 days in the facility conducting stability assessments. During her second afternoon, she reported a detailed memory of attending a staff meeting in the administrative offices where I currently sat. She described the meeting with remarkable specificity. 12 attendees, discussion of patient care protocols and staffing shortages, a particular tension between the facility director and the head nurse. She could recall the uncomfortable chair she'd sat in, the view through the windows of the courtyard in late summer, the taste of weak coffee from a percolator in the corner. The memory was detailed enough that Dr. Voss's team had been able to research it. They'd obtained the facility's archived records, which confirmed that such a meeting had indeed occurred. But in August of 1979, 16 years before Patricia Kimball was born, the meeting notes matched her recollection almost exactly. 12 attendees whose names she'd somehow known, discussions of topics she described, even the same tension between the director and head nurse that appeared in multiple documents from that period. How is this possible? I asked, staring at the documentation. That's what I need you to help me understand, Dr. Voss said. My background is in cognitive neuroscience, but my expertise is in sensory processing and perception. You've spent your career studying false memory formation, understanding how the brain constructs memories of events that never occurred. What we're seeing here appears to be that process, but triggered by environmental factors rather than suggestion or neural manipulation. The building is somehow inducing the formation of memories that are neurologically genuine but experientially false. Except they're not entirely false, I said, still studying Patricia Kimball's case file. The meeting happened just 40 years before she remembered attending it. That's not false memory formation. That's something else entirely. Borrowed memory, Dr. Voss suggested. Memory transference. The building somehow retains impressions of events that occurred within it, and under certain conditions, it transfers those impressions to new occupants, like a recording, as I said, or perhaps more accurately, like a resonance. The architecture itself becomes a medium for memory storage. The hypothesis was insane. Memory required biological substrate, neurons, synapses, the complex biochemistry of neurotransmitter systems. Architecture was inert matter, concrete and steel and glass incapable of the dynamic processes that consciousness and memory demanded. And yet the data was there. Dozens of cases, all documented, all showing the same impossible pattern. I want to experience it, I said. Dr. Voss had been expecting this. I anticipated you would. We have protocols in place. Continuous neural monitoring, regular check-ins, immediate extraction if you signal distress. The residential units on the second floor seemed to be particularly active. That's where most of the patient housing was located, where the most time was spent and the most routine activities occurred. I suggest starting there, with no more than 2 hours of initial exposure. He equipped me with what felt like an excessive amount of monitoring gear. A portable EEG cap with 16 channels, far more sophisticated than the equipment I'd brought from my own lab. A subcutaneous glucose monitor to track metabolic changes. A heart rate monitor. An emergency beacon I could activate if I became disoriented or distressed. He made me sign liability waivers and informed consent forms, though I noticed they were generic documents rather than the specific protocols that true experimental research would require. The residential units are 1 floor down, Dr. Voss said, leading me to a stairwell. Take the stairs rather than the elevator. The elevator's functional, but it's unpredictable, and I prefer to have you on a reliable exit route. The main corridor runs the length of the building with 4 wings branching off. A wing is the most stable, the least active. If you want to start conservatively, that's where I'd recommend. The stairwell was concrete and metal, the kind that exists as architectural afterthought in institutional buildings. Our footsteps echoed with a flatness that suggested acoustic dead zones, spaces where sound didn't behave as it should. The temperature dropped as we descended, not gradually but in distinct layers, as if passing through invisible boundaries between different microclimates. The second floor corridor was wider than the third floor had been, with higher ceilings and more natural light from windows at regular intervals. The walls were painted institutional green, a color that had been ubiquitous in mid-century facilities because it was supposed to be calming, though psychological research had long since demonstrated that the particular shade typically achieved the opposite effect. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, each with a small window and a number placard. The doors were solid wood, institutional grade, with the kind of heavy-duty hardware designed to withstand abuse. The residential units were private rooms for higher-functioning patients, Dr. Voss explained. Dormitory-style arrangements for those requiring more supervision were on the first floor. These rooms were meant to be somewhat homey, to maintain dignity and privacy while still allowing staff oversight. Each room has a bed, a small desk, a closet, and an attached bathroom. No mirrors. Policy prohibited mirrors in patient rooms. Too much risk of self-harm. He stopped at a door marked 2A07. This room has been associated with relatively mild effects. Several people have reported sensory impressions, sounds, smells, temperature changes, but no full memory insertions. It's a good starting point. The door wasn't locked. It opened with a mechanical click and a faint squeal of hinges that needed oil. The room beyond was exactly as Dr. Voss had described. Small, perhaps 12 feet by 15, with a narrow bed frame against one wall, a desk beneath the window, a closet with a door that hung slightly crooked. The attached bathroom was visible through an open doorway, toilet, sink, shower stall, all in the same institutional green as the corridor walls. The room smelled of dust and stale air, but underneath those expected scents was something else. Fabric softener, a particular brand, Downy April Fresh, that I recognized because my grandmother had used it when I was a child. The scent was faint but unmistakable, utterly incongruous with 3 decades of abandonment. The monitoring shows you're experiencing elevated neural activity in your olfactory cortex and amygdala, Dr. Voss said, checking a tablet that displayed real-time data from my EEG cap. That's normal. The sensory manifestations typically appear within the first few minutes. Try to remain calm, observe what you experience, and remember that you can leave at any time. "I'll be fine," I said, with more confidence than I felt. Dr. Voss nodded. "I'll be in the corridor, signal if you need anything." He closed the door and I was alone in the room. The silence was profound. Not the simple absence of sound, but something more complete, as if the space absorbed noise rather than merely reflecting it. My breathing seemed too loud, my heartbeat visible in the pulse at my wrists and throat. I moved to the window and looked out onto the courtyard I'd glimpsed earlier from the third floor. The courtyard was perhaps 50 feet square, enclosed by the building's wings. It had been landscaped once. I could see the remnants of garden beds, a concrete pathway, what might have been a fountain in the center. Desert plants had reclaimed most of it now, sage and tumbleweed growing through cracked concrete, but the bones of intentional design remained visible. I turned from the window and sat on the bed frame. The mattress was long gone, leaving only a metal frame with wire mesh support. The mesh sagged under my weight, springs protesting with small metallic complaints. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sensory input Dr. Voss had prepared me to expect. The smell of fabric softener was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Underneath it, I could detect other scents: institutional soap, something floral that might have been shampoo or lotion, the particular smell of old paper. The temperature in the room felt warmer than the corridor, but not uncomfortably so. The warmth had a quality to it, like sunlight through windows, though the actual light coming through the window was the flat gray of eastern Washington overcast. I opened my eyes. The room looked the same but felt different, occupied. Not by any visible presence, but by the impression of occupation. The space had been lived in, that much was obvious, but what I was experiencing went beyond the reasonable deduction that rooms in residential facilities are inhabited. I could almost see, not with my eyes, but with some other sense I didn't have words for, the layers of human presence that the room retained. Time compressed in strange ways. Decades of abandonment collapsing into moments of use. A sound reached me from the corridor. Footsteps, but not Dr. Voss's measured adult stride. These were lighter, quicker, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. I stood and moved to the door, pressing my face to the small window. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered in their irregular pattern, casting unstable shadows that moved independent of any visible source. But the footsteps continued, growing closer, and with them came voices. Young voices, adolescent, engaged in conversation too quiet for me to distinguish words but clear enough to identify cadence and tone. The footsteps passed my door. I tracked them by sound, hearing them proceed down the corridor toward the far end of the wing. The voices faded with them, diminishing into silence that felt more complete than before, as if their presence had briefly violated the space's fundamental emptiness, and their departure restored proper abandonment. My heart rate had elevated significantly. The monitor strapped to my chest would be recording that, along with whatever neural changes accompanied the experience. I recognized what was happening with clinical detachment, even as I experienced it with primitive unease. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon in isolation or suggestive environments. The brain, that pattern-seeking machine, will construct sensory input to fill unexpected voids. What I was hearing was likely my auditory cortex's attempt to populate the building with the human activity it expected to contain. but the explanation felt insufficient. The footsteps had been too specific, too consistent with what footsteps would actually sound like in this corridor. The squeaking of rubber-soled institutional shoes on institutional flooring had an authenticity that my imagination shouldn't have been able to construct without reference. I returned to the bed frame and sat again, deliberately trying to calm my elevated heart rate through controlled breathing. The EEG cap pressed against my scalp, its sensors reading electrical activity that would tell Dr. Voss's team more about my neurological state than I could introspect on my own. The subcutaneous glucose monitor in my arm tracked metabolic changes invisible to consciousness. I was simultaneously experiencing subject and being monitored object, dual role that created a strange dissociation. Time behaved oddly. I'd been in the room perhaps 20 minutes, but the quality of light through the window suggested longer. The gray overcast had shifted, implying sun movement that didn't match elapsed time. I checked my watch, a simple analog device that couldn't be blamed on battery failure or digital malfunction, and found it reading 2:47 p.m. Reasonable. I'd entered the room around 2:30. But the light looked wrong for mid-afternoon. Too orange, too horizontal, more like evening than afternoon. The smell in the room continued to evolve. The fabric softener had faded, replaced by something else. Cooking odors, distant but distinct. Institutional food preparation, boiled vegetables, baked chicken, the particular starchy smell of bulk mashed potatoes. My stomach responded with hunger, which was absurd. I'd eaten lunch in the car during the drive, but the hunger felt genuine, physiological, accompanied by the specific anticipation that comes with knowing food is approaching. A bell rang, not loud but clear, a mechanical ringing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the building with its summoning tone. I recognized it intellectually as a call bell, the kind that marked institutional routines, meals, medication, shift changes. But I also recognized it with a different kind of knowledge, one that came from somewhere other than my personal history. Dinner bell, 6 o'clock. Line up in the corridor, wait for staff escort to the dining hall. I stood without deciding to stand. My body moved with purpose, responding to the bell with practiced routine. I reached for the door handle, turned it, pulled the door open, and stepped into the corridor. The corridor had changed. Not dramatically, the same green walls, the same numbered doors, the same fluorescent lighting, but the quality of the space was different, occupied, inhabited, real in a way it hadn't been before. Other doors were opening. People emerged from rooms, young people mostly, teenagers and young adults moving with the particular shuffle of institutional residents. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. They simply formed a loose line in the corridor, facing toward the far end where the wing met the main hallway. I wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but something prevented me. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that speaking would be inappropriate, would violate the routine that everyone else understood. I joined the line, falling in behind a girl who might have been 17 or 18. She wore a simple dress, floral print, with canvas shoes that had been white once but were now gray with wear. Her hair was brown, pulled back in a ponytail secured with a rubber band that had left a crease where it gripped too tight. The line began to move. We walked in silence down the corridor, through the door at the far end, into the main hallway. Other lines emerged from other wings, streams of residents converging into a larger flow. The population was diverse, different ages, different apparent levels of function, all moving with the same practiced routine toward a destination we all somehow knew. I should have been terrified. Some part of me was terrified, a small rational fragment that recognized I was hallucinating or dissociating or experiencing some kind of break from consensus reality. But that fragment was distant, overwhelmed by the immediate reality of the experience. I was here in this moment, participating in an evening routine that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. The dining hall occupied the building's west wing, a large space with long tables and benches that could seat perhaps 100 people at once. The room was painted the same institutional green, with high windows that let in light that matched the orange evening quality I'd noticed in my room. The smell of food was overwhelming now, not appetizing exactly, but compelling. The way institutional food becomes compelling when you're genuinely hungry and accustomed to its particular textures and flavors. We filed to tables according to some organizational logic I understood without being able to articulate. I found myself at a table near the windows, sitting between the girl I'd followed in the corridor and a boy who might have been 20, with Down syndrome and a gentle smile that seemed to exist independent of external stimulus. Across from me sat an older woman, perhaps 50, whose tremor suggested Parkinson's or similar neurological deterioration. Staff members moved through the space, young women mostly, wearing simple dresses or slacks with button-up shirts, name tags pinned to their chests. One approached our table carrying a tray loaded with plates. She set them down with practiced efficiency, one before each resident. The portions were generous but institutional. Chicken breast gray from overbaking, mashed potatoes stiff enough to hold their scooped shape, green beans boiled to submission, a slice of white bread with margarine. I picked up my fork. The utensil felt strange in my hand, too light, with a plastic handle that my actual memories insisted shouldn't exist in a 1970s institutional facility. But my other memories, the ones that weren't mine but somehow were, accepted it as normal, as the correct utensil for this meal. I was raising the fork to my mouth when reality reasserted itself with jarring violence. The dining hall was empty. The tables, the benches, the staff members, the other residents, all gone. I sat alone in a large room that smelled of dust and abandonment, holding a plastic fork that wasn't there, staring at a plate of food that had never existed. The windows showed the correct light, afternoon gray, not evening orange. The temperature was wrong, too cold, the warmth of the occupied space replaced by the neutral chill of abandonment. My heart hammered against my ribs. The EEG cap on my head felt like it was squeezing my skull. The subcutaneous monitor in my arm burned with sudden awareness. I dropped the non-existent fork and stood so quickly that I knocked over the bench I'd been sitting on. The crash of metal against concrete echoed through the empty room, real sound in real space, confirming that I was back in consensus reality. The emergency beacon was in my pocket. I activated it without thinking, pressing the button that would summon Dr. Voss and his team. Then I ran. I didn't run toward anything, just away from the dining hall and the impossible experience I just had. My feet carried me into the main corridor, past the junction where the wings met, toward the stairwell that led back to the third floor and the administrative offices. The corridor was empty, properly empty, without the overlay of occupation I'd experienced before. The fluorescent lights flickered. My breathing echoed. Everything was exactly as it should be in an abandoned building. Dr. Voss met me at the base of the stairwell. He was running, or as close to running as a man his age could manage while maintaining dignity. Behind him came two other team members I hadn't met, a young man and woman who looked like graduate students or research assistants. They all had the focused concern of researchers responding to an experimental subject in distress. Dr. Castellanos, Dr. Voss said, reaching for my arm to steady me though I wasn't swaying. Are you all right? Your monitors showed extreme neural activity and then sudden cessation. What happened? I wanted to answer, but my mouth wouldn't form words. The experience was too immediate, too raw. I could still smell the dining hall food, still feel the plastic fork in my hand, still see the girl with the brown ponytail sitting beside me. The memories were fading even as I tried to hold them, dissolving like dreams upon waking, but their emotional residue remained. Confusion, displacement, the profound wrongness of experiencing time that wasn't mine. I managed finally. I need to sit down, somewhere that isn't here. They took me back to the administrative offices, settling me into a chair that faced away from the windows. One of the research assistants brought water in a plastic bottle that felt absurdly normal, mundane in a way that bordered on offensive. Dr. Voss removed my EEG cap with careful movements, disconnecting sensors, his face showing the kind of focused attention that people in crisis often find either comforting or infuriating. I found it both. Tell me what you experienced, he said, once I'd drunk half the water and my breathing had returned to something approaching normal. Take your time. Be as specific as possible. I told him. The progression from sensory impressions to auditory hallucinations to full immersion in a memory that wasn't mine. The dinner bell, the line of residence, the dining hall meal that had felt completely real until the moment it vanished. The details poured out with the kind of precision that surprised me. I could describe the girl's ponytail, the boy's gentle smile, the texture of the institutional mashed potatoes, the exact quality of the light through the windows. Dr. Voss listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a tablet. The two research assistants, introduced as Marcus and Jennifer, monitored the data streaming from the sensors I still wore. When I finished, the room was silent except for the hum of equipment and the faint sound of wind against the building's exterior. The neural patterns are extraordinary, Marcus said, studying his screen. The hippocampal activation during the experience matches what we'd see in genuine episodic memory recall, but the temporal lobe activity suggests memory consolidation in real time. You weren't just accessing a stored memory, you were forming one, actively encoding an experience as it occurred. Except the experience didn't occur, I said. Not to me. I wasn't in that dining hall in when? The 70s, the 80s. Based on your description, likely late 70s, Dr. Voss said. The details match that period. The plastic utensils were introduced in 1977 after a patient injury incident involving metal forks. The staff-to-patient ratios you observed are consistent with the facility's staffing records from 1978 to 1981. You experienced a genuine memory of a routine dinner service from approximately 45 years ago. But how? I demanded. Memory requires encoding, neural consolidation, biochemical processes that happen in living tissue. This building isn't alive. It can't store memories. It can't transfer them. What I experienced is neurologically impossible. Yet it happened, Dr. Voss said quietly, as it's happened to dozens of others. The impossibility doesn't negate the reality. I stood, pacing the small office space, trying to work through the implications. My training insisted on materialist explanations. There had to be a mechanism, some physical process that could account for what I'd experienced. Electromagnetic fields affecting neural activity, infrasound creating sensory disturbances. Mass suggestion amplified by setting and expectation. But none of those explanations could account for the specificity, the consistency, the verifiable accuracy of details I couldn't have known. The building has to be a medium, I said, thinking aloud. Like you suggested, something about its architecture, its materials, the specific configuration of its spaces. It's recording human activity somehow. Neural activity creates electromagnetic fields. Thoughts, memories, experiences, they're all electrical patterns. Maybe under certain conditions, those patterns can be impressed onto physical substrate. The building becomes a kind of three-dimensional recording medium. And when new neural activity enters the space, it resonates with the recorded patterns, creating a feedback loop that generates subjective experience. That's essentially my hypothesis, Dr. Voss said. Though the mechanism remains unknown, we've measured every electromagnetic field, every subsonic frequency, every environmental variable we can detect. Nothing correlates consistently with the memory insertion events. The effect seems to depend on individual susceptibility, duration of exposure, and location within the building, but we can't predict who will experience it or when. What about the residents? I asked. The people I saw, the girl, the boy, the woman, were they real? Did they exist? Jennifer looked up from her screen. We've been working on identification. The facility kept detailed records, including photographs. If you're willing to look through archived patient files, you might be able to identify individuals you encountered. The prospect filled me with dread, confirming that the people I'd seen were real, that they'd lived in this building and followed the routines I'd experienced, would make the experience more real in ways I wasn't prepared to accept. But my curiosity, that fundamental researchers need to know, overwhelmed my reluctance. Show me, I said. The archived records occupied a filing system that had been digitized with obvious care and expense. Thousands of pages scanned at high resolution, organized by admission date and patient identifier. Jennifer pulled up a gallery view showing patient intake photographs from the late 1970s. Black and white images, institutional quality, showing faces that tried to maintain dignity despite the dehumanizing context of psychiatric documentation. I found the girl with the brown ponytail in less than 5 minutes. Her name was Rebecca Marsh, admitted in February 1976 at age 16 for what the records termed developmental delay and behavioral disturbances. The intake photo showed her younger than I'd seen her, but unmistakably the same person, the same facial structure, the same expression of wary acceptance. The records indicated she'd remained at the facility until its closure in 1993, when she was transferred to a group home in Spokane. She'd be 65 now, Jennifer said quietly, if she's still alive. The boy with Down syndrome was Daniel Cortez, admitted in 1974 at age 18. The older woman with the tremor was Margaret Sullivan, a long-term resident who'd been transferred from another facility when it closed. One by one, I identified the people I'd sat with in the dining hall that had never existed, finding their faces in archived photographs, confirming that my experience had corresponded to actual individuals who had occupied the space I'd occupied, eating meals at tables that were now absent, living lives that had ended or moved on decades ago. This proves nothing about mechanism, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. I could have seen these files before. Dr. Voss could have shown me photographs during his presentation, and I integrated them into my hallucination unconsciously. I didn't show you patient files, Dr. Voss said. Only structural and staffing documentation. And you've been monitored continuously since your arrival. There's been no opportunity for you to access the archives. The probability of you randomly hallucinating specific individuals who happen to be residents during the correct time period is vanishingly small. He was right, and I knew it. What I'd experienced wasn't random confabulation. It was memory, genuine, detailed, accurate memory of events I hadn't lived through, absorbed somehow from the building itself. The implications were staggering. If architecture could store and transmit memory, if spaces could retain impressions of human consciousness, then everything we understood about the relationship between mind and matter required reevaluation. I need to go back, I said. Dr. Voss frowned. I don't recommend that. Your neural activity during the experience showed significant stress patterns. Prolonged exposure could. Could what? I interrupted. Give me more impossible memories. Help me understand what's happening here. I didn't come here to look at data from a safe distance. I came to understand the phenomenon. That requires exposure. The memories fade, Marcus reminded me, usually within 72 hours. But fragments remain, and they can integrate into your actual memory architecture. You could end up with persistent false memories, difficulty distinguishing your real past from experiences you've absorbed here. We've seen it in previous subjects. Informed consent, I said. I understand the risks. I'm choosing to proceed. Dr. Voss studied me for a long moment, and I saw him weighing professional responsibility against research opportunity. The calculation was familiar. I'd made it myself in my own studies, balancing subject welfare against the need for data. Finally, he nodded. Different location this time, he said. The residential units produce relatively contained experiences, specific memories, bounded in time and space. But the common areas, the places where routines were most established, those tend to generate longer, more immersive experiences. If you're determined to continue, I suggest the occupational therapy room. It's less intense than the dining hall, but more active than residential units. We returned to the second floor, but this time we moved deeper into the building's interior. The occupational therapy room was located in the south wing, accessible through a corridor that felt narrower than it physically was, walls pressing in with psychological weight if not actual proximity. The doors we passed were labeled with purposes rather than numbers. Storage, laundry, physical therapy, group room B. The occupational therapy room was larger than I'd expected, perhaps 40 feet by 60, with high windows along one wall and fluorescent fixtures that cast flat institutional light across space that had been designed for activity. Long tables occupied the center of the room, their surfaces scarred with decades of use, cuts, burns, stains that told stories of craft projects and frustrated outbursts. Shelves along the walls held the detritus of therapeutic activity. Balls of yarn tangled and dusty, incomplete puzzles with pieces missing, boxes of colored pencils that had probably dried out 20 years ago. Occupational therapy was considered progressive in the 70s, Dr. Voss explained as he fitted me with fresh monitoring equipment. The idea was to maintain fine motor skills and provide purposeful activity. Residents would come here for structured sessions, arts and crafts, basic woodworking, simple assembly tasks. The routine was consistent, 5 days a week, 2 sessions per day. Morning session from 10 to noon, afternoon session from 2 to 4. He checked his watch. It's currently 3:47 p.m. If the pattern holds, you should experience an afternoon session, assuming you experience anything at all. Remember, the effect isn't guaranteed. Some people spend hours in active spaces and experience nothing but general unease. What's the longest anyone has stayed immersed in an experience? I asked. Subjectively, one of our contractors reported experiencing an entire 8-hour shift, start to finish, working in the building's maintenance department. Objectively, he was only in the space for 45 minutes. Time dilation seems to be a consistent feature. Experiences extend beyond real elapsed time. We don't understand why. The monitoring equipment was more extensive this time. In addition to the EEG cap and physiological sensors, they'd added a camera mounted on my shoulder that would record my visual field, and a microphone that would capture any vocalizations or environmental sounds. I also wore a GPS tracker, which seemed absurd inside a building, until Dr. Voss explained that previous subjects had become disoriented, unable to find their way back to the administrative offices even from familiar corridors. "We'll be monitoring in real time," Jennifer said, showing me a tablet displaying the data streams from my various sensors. "If we see signs of extreme distress or if your vital signs become concerning, we'll come in and extract you physically if necessary. You also have the emergency beacon. Don't hesitate to use it." "How will you know when I'm experiencing an immersive episode?" I asked. "The neural signature is distinctive," Marcus explained. "When the memory insertion occurs, we see simultaneous activation across multiple brain regions: hippocampus, amygdala, prefrontal cortex, sensory processing areas. It's not like dreaming or imagination, where activity is scattered and inconsistent. It's more like the entire brain is engaged in processing a coherent experience. We'll know within seconds when it begins." They left me alone in the occupational therapy room. The door closed with a solid click, and I was surrounded by the accumulated detritus of abandoned therapeutic activity. I sat at one of the long tables, my hands resting on the scarred surface, and waited. The first change was temperature. The room had been cool, but warmth spread through the space like invisible water filling a container. It wasn't the mechanical warmth of forced air heating, but something more organic, the warmth that comes from human bodies in proximity, from activity and breath and life. Sound followed. Distant at first, footsteps in the corridor, the opening and closing of doors, voices too indistinct for words. Then closer, more specific. The squeak of a cart with misaligned wheels. Someone humming, a simple melody I almost recognized. Paper rustling. The particular clicking sound of pencils or crayons rolling across a wooden surface. The light changed. The flat institutional fluorescence softened, acquiring warmth and texture. Shadows appeared where they shouldn't be, cast by bodies that weren't there yet. The windows showed afternoon light, still gray but different, with a quality that suggested a different season, a different year. I felt it beginning, the shift from observer to participant. My perspective was changing, not physically but cognitively. I was becoming someone else, someone who belonged in this space and time. My hands on the table surface looked the same but felt different, younger, with the particular awareness that comes from occupying a body you're still growing into. My clothes weren't what I'd worn to the facility. Instead, I wore simple cotton pants and a t-shirt, institutional issue, comfortable but impersonal. The door opened, and residents began to enter. They filed in with practiced routine, moving to tables they'd been assigned. settling into chairs with the automatic movements of frequently repeated action. A young woman took the seat beside me. She had red hair cut short, freckles across her nose and cheeks, and a birthmark on her left forearm shaped like an elongated teardrop. "Margaret's in the infirmary," she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone heavily medicated. "They said pneumonia, but I think it's her heart. She's been saying her chest hurts for weeks, but nobody listens when Margaret complains. They think she's just looking for attention." I knew I should respond, and somehow I knew what response was expected. "Is she going to be okay?" The redhead shrugged. "Probably. She's too mean to die. Last year she had that infection and they thought she was gone for sure, but she pulled through just to spite them. That's what Daniel says anyway. Says Margaret's powered by pure spite." Staff members entered carrying supplies. The session was arts and crafts, simple projects designed to maintain fine motor skills and provide sense of accomplishment. We were making seasonal decorations, autumn-themed because the light through the windows had that quality of late September or early October. Construction paper, scissors with rounded tips, glue sticks, markers in a rainbow of colors. A staff member I somehow knew was named Caroline distributed materials to each table. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a name tag pinned to her blue scrubs. Her smile was professionally warm, the kind that people develop when their job requires emotional labor they can't fully provide authentically. "We're making leaf garlands today," Caroline announced, her voice carrying across the room. "I'll show you how to trace the pattern, and then you can cut out as many leaves as you want. We'll string them together with yarn and hang them in the dining hall for the Harvest Festival." The Harvest Festival. I knew about it, knew it was scheduled for 2 weeks from now, knew that there would be decorations and special food, and a visit from a local church group that would provide musical entertainment. The knowledge came without effort, available the way my own memories were available, except these weren't my memories. They belonged to someone else, someone who occupied this space and time, someone whose identity I was temporarily inhabiting. I picked up scissors and began tracing leaf patterns onto orange construction paper. The activity was simple but engaging, requiring focus and coordination. Around me, other residents did the same, some working with quick efficiency, others struggling with the fine motor control required to cut smooth curves. The redhead beside me, her name was Patricia, I suddenly knew, though I hadn't known a moment before, worked with careful precision, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. Time passed in the strange way it does during repetitive activity. I cut leaves and glued them to yarn, creating a garland that grew longer with each addition. The room filled with the sounds of productivity, scissors through paper, conversations in small groups, occasional laughter when someone's leaf came out particularly distorted or someone made a joke I didn't catch. Caroline moved through the room offering encouragement and assistance. She stopped at our table examining Patricia's work. "Beautiful, Patricia. The color choices are very creative." Then to me, "How are you doing, Sarah?" Sarah, that was my name in this time and place. I knew it with immediate certainty, knew that I was Sarah Brennan, admitted 14 months ago after a breakdown at my university, diagnosed with schizophrenia, though my symptoms were really just severe anxiety that manifested in ways that frightened my roommates and concerned the campus health center. I was 19 years old, and I'd been promised I could go home for Thanksgiving if I continued to make progress in therapy. "I'm fine," I heard myself say, and the voice that came from my mouth was younger than my actual voice. with a slight tremor that suggested uncertainty or medication side effects. Caroline smiled and moved on to the next table. I continued making my garland, caught in the rhythm of the activity, while simultaneously aware that none of this was real, that I was Dr. Myra Castellanos experiencing the memories of someone named Sarah Brennan who had existed in this space decades ago. The dual consciousness was disorienting. I could feel both perspectives, my own and Sarah's, existing simultaneously, overlapping but not quite merging. I knew I was wearing monitoring equipment and that Dr. Voss's team was watching my neural activity. But I also knew that I needed to finish at least 20 leaves before the session ended, that Patricia would be upset if I didn't keep pace with her, because she liked having someone to work alongside, that my medication made my hands shake slightly, but not enough to prevent functional activity. An alarm sounded, not an emergency alarm, but a simple bell indicating the end of the session. The shift was at 4 o'clock, I knew, though I couldn't see a clock to confirm. Residents began cleaning up their work areas, returning supplies to centralized containers, carrying their completed projects to a storage area where they would be collected and assembled into larger decorations. I stood, holding my garland, and moved toward the storage area. The garland was longer than I'd realized, perhaps 6 feet of yarn with construction paper leaves at regular intervals. Some of the leaves were precisely cut, others more abstract, but they formed a coherent whole that would look cheerful hanging in the dining hall. As I placed the garland in the storage bin, reality shifted. Not abruptly, but like a slow dissolve, one image fading as another emerged. The occupational therapy room emptied of people. The supplies vanished. The warmth drained away. The construction paper leaves I'd been holding dissolved into dust and air, leaving my hands empty and cold. I was standing alone in an abandoned room, surrounded by tables that bore the scars of decades-old craft projects. The windows showed the correct light, late afternoon in early October, but my October, not Sarah Brennan's. The monitoring equipment pressed against my body, sensors reading neural activity, camera recording empty space, microphone capturing only my breathing and the building's ambient sounds. The transition was gentler this time, less jarring than my experience in the dining hall, perhaps because I'd expected it, or because the experience itself had been less emotionally intense. But the emotional residue remained. I felt Sarah Brennan's cautious optimism about Thanksgiving, her medication-dulled affect, her simple pleasure in completing a task and receiving Caroline's approval. I activated the beacon, and within minutes Dr. Voss and his team arrived. They found me sitting at one of the tables, staring at my empty hands, trying to hold onto memories that were already fading like morning fog under sunlight. I was Sarah Brennan, I told them, 19 years old, admitted in 1978 or 1979. She was making leaf garlands for a harvest festival. She wanted to go home for Thanksgiving. Jennifer was already pulling up archived records on her tablet. Sarah Brennan, admitted September 1978, discharged December 1980. Diagnosis of schizophrenia, though later records suggest the diagnosis was questionable. She was released to family care and enrolled in outpatient therapy. No further institutional admissions. She'd be, she paused, calculating, about 65 now. Is she alive? I asked. I don't know, Jennifer admitted. We haven't traced all former residents, but we can find out. I nodded, not sure why it mattered whether Sarah Brennan was alive, only knowing that it did. The experience had been intimate in ways that made me feel responsible somehow, as if I'd borrowed something precious and needed to return it. Dr. Voss helped me remove the monitoring equipment. The neural patterns were even more pronounced this time, he said. Fuller integration, stronger memory consolidation. You weren't just observing Sarah Brennan's experience, you were inhabiting it. The boundary between you and her had become permeable. I could feel both of us, I said, simultaneously. I knew I was Myra, but I also knew I was Sarah. Dual consciousness, but not dissociated. More like overlay. Two transparencies placed on top of each other, both visible, both real. That's consistent with other reports, Marcus said. The most immersive experiences involve that sense of dual identity. And the longer the exposure, the more complete the integration becomes. Some subjects have reported losing track of which memories were theirs and which belonged to the person they were experiencing. How long was I in there? I asked. Subjectively, it felt like 45 minutes to an hour. 17 minutes, Dr. Voss said, from the moment you sat down until you activated the beacon. The time dilation was extreme. I'd experienced nearly an hour of memory in 17 minutes of elapsed time. If the ratio held consistent, someone could experience an entire day in a fraction of actual duration. The implications for consciousness, for time perception, for the fundamental nature of subjective experience, they were staggering. I want to try one more location, I said. Somewhere that would have been even more routinized, more densely occupied. Where would the effect be strongest? Dr. Voss hesitated. The strongest effects are in spaces where the most intense emotions were experienced. Not necessarily routine spaces, but crisis spaces. The medical examination rooms. The isolation cells used for residents who became violent or unstable. The staff break room where difficult decisions were made and professional stress accumulated. Those spaces tend to produce not calm memories like craft sessions, but traumatic ones. Fear, pain, confusion, desperation. Show me, I said. Dr. Castellanos, I strongly advise against. I didn't come here to experience the pleasant memories, I interrupted. The interesting question isn't whether happy routine gets recorded. It's whether trauma does. Whether the architecture retains not just neutral activity but emotional extremes. That's where the real research value lies. I could see him calculating again, weighing risks against potential insights. Finally, he nodded. The medical examination rooms are in the east wing, first floor, but I'm setting strict limits. 15 minutes maximum exposure. At the first sign of severe distress, we extract you immediately. And you need to rest first, let your neural activity return to baseline. The cumulative effects of multiple exposures aren't fully understood. They brought me food, sandwiches from a cooler, fruit, bottled water. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, my mind still processing the dual memories of being Sarah Brennan making autumn decorations. The memories were fading already, details blurring, but the emotional core remained. That was what memory was, ultimately. Not perfect recording, but emotional impression. The feeling of an experience outlasting its specific details. We waited 2 hours while my neural activity returned to what Dr. Voss considered acceptable baseline. I spent the time reviewing more archived records, putting faces to the residents I'd encountered in my 2 immersions. Rebecca Marsh, the girl with the ponytail. Daniel Cortez with his gentle smile. Patricia with red hair and freckles. Margaret Sullivan, who powered herself with spite. Caroline, the staff member, with her professional warmth. They were real people who had lived real lives. and I had temporarily inhabited their memories, experienced fragments of their existence. The ethical implications troubled me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I was using their past without consent, accessing experiences they might not want shared, even if the sharing was temporary and the memories would fade. Yet they were gone from this place. Their lives moved on or ended, and what remained here was only echo, architectural resonance that would exist whether anyone experienced it or not. "I'm ready," I said finally, though I wasn't sure that was true. The east wing felt different from the start, colder, though the temperature readings showed no variation from the rest of the building. The corridor was narrower, with lower ceilings that created a sense of compression. The doors were different too, solid metal rather than wood, with small windows reinforced with wire mesh and heavy-duty locks that suggested they'd been designed to contain rather than merely enclose. The medical examination room served multiple purposes, Dr. Voss explained as we walked. Routine health checks, certainly, but also physical restraint during episodes of aggression or self-harm, medication administration for patients who refused oral doses, involuntary procedures when residents were deemed incompetent to consent. The facility operated during a period when patient autonomy wasn't prioritized the way it is now. He stopped at a door marked Medical 3. Unlike the residential units, this door was locked. Dr. Voss produced a key and turned it with a mechanical click that echoed down the corridor. "Are you certain about this?" "Yes," I said, with more confidence than I felt. The examination room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a medical examination table in the center. The table was padded vinyl over metal frame, with stirrups that could be positioned for gynecological exams and leather restraints attached to the corners. Cabinets lined one wall, their glass doors revealing empty shelves that had once held medical supplies. A sink occupied another wall, stainless steel, with separate taps for hot and cold water. The room smelled of old disinfectant and something else, something organic and unpleasant that decades hadn't fully eradicated. The monitoring equipment felt heavier this time, more intrusive. Or perhaps I was simply more conscious of it, more aware that I was deliberately subjecting myself to experience that might be traumatic. Dr. Voss triple-checked every sensor, every connection, his movements betraying an anxiety he was trying to conceal professionally. "Remember," he said, 15 minutes maximum. If you experience severe distress, use the beacon immediately. We'll be monitoring constantly. Any sign of danger and we're coming in." "I understand," I said. The door closed behind him. I was alone in the examination room, surrounded by the accumulated weight of medical procedures performed without true consent, of bodies restrained and medicated and violated in the name of treatment. The space held that weight the way stone holds heat, radiating it back into the present. I sat on the examination table because it seemed appropriate, because that's what patients did, because the table was the center of whatever memories this room contained. The vinyl was cracked with age, foam padding visible through splits in the material. The stirrups were positioned outward, waiting for feet that would never again occupy them. The restraints hung loose, their leather darkened with old sweat and fear. The temperature dropped precipitously, not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had opened a door to winter. My breath became visible, small clouds that dissipated slowly in air that had become thick and resistant. The fluorescent lights flickered and dimmed, their frequency shifting to something that made my vision swim and my stomach clench. Sound came first this time, Not footsteps or voices, but something more immediate and visceral. Breathing, rapid and harsh. The kind of breathing that comes with panic or extreme physical exertion. Crying, choked and desperate, trying to be quiet and failing. And underneath those human sounds, something mechanical. The hum of equipment, the beep of monitors, sounds that shouldn't have existed in a 1970s facility, but did. Because memory isn't always accurate, because fear distorts and amplifies. The door opened though it didn't move. Two figures entered though I saw them only as impressions, shadows more substantial than they should be. One was a staff member, male, large, with the particular body language of someone accustomed to using physical force. The other was smaller, resistant, being dragged or carried. A resident, young, perhaps 16 or 17, fighting with the desperate strength that comes from genuine terror. I realized with horror that I wasn't going to be the staff member in this memory. I was going to be the resident. The perspective shift was violent and immediate. I was no longer sitting on the examination table but being forced onto it. Strong hands gripping my arms, my legs, pinning me down despite my struggles. I tried to scream, but someone's hand covered my mouth, pressing hard enough that I tasted blood from a split lip. The leather restraints cinched tight around my wrists and ankles, their buckles clicking with terrible finality. "Stop fighting," a voice said, male, tired rather than cruel. "This is for your own good. You need to calm down." But I couldn't calm down because I understood, with the perfect clarity that comes from living through something rather than observing it, that something terrible was about to happen. Not because the staff intended cruelty, but because the entire system was structured around control rather than care, around management rather than treatment. Whatever was about to be done to me would be done not out of sadism, but out of the profound indifference that institutional systems develop toward individual suffering. A door opened and another figure entered. White coat, name tag I couldn't read, the particular posture of medical authority. A doctor, probably, or someone playing that role. They carried a metal tray with implements I couldn't quite see, instruments that caught the fluorescent light and reflected it in cold steel gleams. "This will help you," the voice said. "You'll feel better afterward, just try to stay still." I didn't want to feel what came next. Didn't want the memory to progress beyond this moment of anticipatory terror into whatever actual trauma had occurred in this room. But I had no control over the experience's progression. It moved forward with dream logic, inevitable and unstoppable, carrying me towards something I desperately wanted to escape. Pain came first. Not physical pain, but the pain of helplessness, of being utterly subject to other people's decisions about your body, your treatment, your basic human dignity. Then actual physical sensation, sharp and invasive, something entering my body that shouldn't, something being done to me without my consent, despite my vocalized objection, despite my visible distress, despite the fundamental wrongness that everyone in the room had to be aware of but chose to ignore for the sake of institutional efficiency. I was screaming. Not Sarah or Rebecca or whoever's memory this was, me, Myra Castellanos, screaming with someone else's voice, experiencing someone else's trauma but feeling it as if it were happening to my body in my time. The dual consciousness that had been interesting in the craft room became unbearable here. I couldn't maintain enough distance to remember I was only experiencing a memory. The pain and violation felt immediate and real and undeniable. I activated the emergency beacon, pressing it repeatedly, desperately, needing extraction with an urgency that bordered on existential panic. But the experience didn't stop. The memory progressed past my activation of the beacon, past my conscious desire to escape, carrying me through procedures that felt endless, though they probably lasted only minutes. The door burst open. Dr. Voss and his team rushed in, but I couldn't see them properly. My vision was overlaid with the examination room as it had been, the figures performing their institutional violence, the medical equipment that didn't belong in the 1970s but existed anyway in traumatic memories' distorted recall. Hands touched me, Dr. Voss's hands, real and present, trying to help me off the examination table where I'd curled into a defensive position. But I couldn't distinguish them from the hands that had restrained me in the memory. I fought them off with the strength that terror provides, screaming words I didn't recognize in a voice that wasn't quite mine. "Myra," Dr. Voss was saying, urgent and insistent. "Dr. Castellanos, you're in the present. October 2025. You're safe. What you're experiencing is memory, not current reality. You need to ground yourself in the present." His words penetrated slowly, fighting through layers of trauma that I'd absorbed from the architectural memory. The examination room began to resolve into its current abandoned state. The figures faded, became shadows, became nothing. The sounds diminished, the mechanized humming and human crying fading into the building's baseline silence. The pain receded, not all at once but in waves, leaving behind a residue that felt like it would never fully dissipate. I collapsed, not onto the examination table but onto the floor, as far from that vinyl surface as I could get. My body was shaking, tremors I couldn't control, reaction to trauma my biology thought it had just experienced. Dr. Voss crouched beside me, not touching but present, waiting for me to signal that physical contact would be acceptable. "How long?" I managed to ask through chattering teeth. 3 minutes, Marcus said from the doorway, his voice shaken. "From the moment you sat down until you activated the beacon. The neural patterns were—" He stopped, apparently deciding that technical description was inappropriate. "We need to get you out of this room." They helped me stand, supported me as we moved into the corridor. The contrast between the examination room and the hallway was striking. The corridor felt warm and safe, and blessedly neutral, empty of everything except present reality. We returned to the administrative offices, where Jennifer had already prepared a medical assessment area. They ran tests, physical examination, cognitive assessment, standard trauma screening protocols. My vital signs were elevated but not dangerous. My speech was coherent once I'd stopped shaking. The monitoring equipment showed that my neural activity was gradually returning to baseline, though the patterns suggested continued processing of emotional trauma. "What you experienced was sexual assault," Dr. Voss said quietly, once the immediate medical concerns had been addressed. "Or something very similar. The room retains that memory. We've had 3 other subjects experience variations of the same event. All describe procedures that would be considered medical assault by contemporary standards, though they were likely considered acceptable treatment protocols at the time. Forced pelvic examinations, administration of progesterone to suppress menstruation, procedures performed without meaningful consent under the justification of managing patient behavior." "Whose memory was it?" I asked. "Do you know?" Jennifer pulled up records on her tablet. "Based on the details you described, the age of the resident, the time period, the specific procedure, it was probably Linda Morrison. Admitted at age 16 in 1976 for behavioral issues that records suggest were likely just normal adolescent sexuality that her conservative family couldn't accept. She was subjected to multiple gynecological procedures during her 18-month residency, all documented in medical records with euphemistic language about behavioral management and hormonal regulation. "Is she alive?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Jennifer's fingers moved across the tablet, pulling up information from databases I didn't want to think about. "Yes, Linda Morrison, now Linda Chen, age 65, living in Portland. Married, 2 adult children, worked as a social worker specializing in foster care before retiring 3 years ago. By all appearances, she built a good life after leaving here." The information should have been comforting. Linda Morrison had survived, had escaped this place and its institutional cruelties, had created a life that the records suggested was fulfilling and meaningful. But knowing that didn't erase what I'd experienced, what she had experienced in that examination room. The memory remained, encoded in the building's architecture, waiting to be relived by anyone sensitive enough to access it. "This is why I hesitated," Dr. Voss said. "The traumatic memories are the most persistent, the most vivid. Joy and routine fade quickly, but trauma leaves deeper impressions. The building remembers suffering with greater fidelity than it remembers contentment." "That's consistent with human neurology," I said, trying to retreat into academic analysis, to create distance through intellectual engagement. The amygdala prioritizes encoding threatening or painful experiences. Survival advantage. We need to remember what hurt us so we can avoid it in the future. If the building is somehow recording neural activity, it makes sense that it would retain traumatic memories more completely. "But how?" Marcus asked. "What's the mechanism? We've measured everything we can think of and nothing explains it. The building is just concrete, steel, and glass. Inert materials that shouldn't be capable of storing or transmitting information, let alone complex neural patterns that generate subjective experience." I stood carefully, testing my legs, confirming that the shaking had subsided enough for mobility. The monitors were still attached to my body, sensors reading my continued physiological recovery. Through the window, I could see that the light had changed, late afternoon becoming evening, the desert landscape outside taking on the orange-gold quality that comes just before sunset. "May I see the building's blueprints?" I asked. "The original architectural plans." Dr. Voss looked surprised by the request but nodded. "Of course, we have the complete construction documentation." "Why?" "Because if the building is functioning as a recording medium, there might be something in its design, intentional or accidental, that enables the effect. Materials with specific properties, spatial configurations that create resonance, something in the geometry or composition that allows neural activity to impress itself onto physical structure." Jennifer pulled up the architectural plans on a large monitor. The building's layout was typical of institutional facilities from its era. Central corridor spine with wings extending at regular intervals, creating a floor plan that resembled a comb or a many-legged insect. The wings contained residential units and specialized rooms. The central spine housed common areas, administrative offices, and mechanical systems. But there were peculiarities. The walls between rooms weren't standard construction. They included a layer of material labeled simply as acoustic dampening compound that the specifications described as experimental. The floor composition included embedded metal mesh, ostensibly for structural reinforcement, but arranged in patterns that seemed more complex than structural necessity would require. The ceiling spaces contained what the plans termed environmental regulation cavities that appeared to serve no clear HVAC purpose. "This isn't standard institutional architecture," I said, tracing the unusual features with my finger on the screen. "These design elements, they're not typical for the period. Who was the architect?" Dr. Voss consulted the documentation. A firm called Resonance Design Associates, based in San Francisco. They specialized in institutional buildings, hospitals, schools, psychiatric facilities. The firm dissolved in 1982 after the principal architect died. I can look for more information about their other projects. "Do that," I said. "I want to know if other buildings designed by this firm exhibit similar effects, and I want detailed analysis of these materials, the acoustic compound, the metal mesh, whatever's in those ceiling cavities. If this building is functioning as a memory storage medium, those elements might be the key." The research plan was forming in my mind, the kind of systematic investigation that my training had prepared me for. Gather data about the architecture's unusual features. Analyze the materials for properties that might interact with electromagnetic fields or other forms of energy associated with neural activity. Compare this building to other structures designed by the same firm. Build a testable hypothesis about mechanism. But beneath the professional excitement, I felt the lingering trauma of Linda Morrison's experience. The memory was fading, as Dr. Voss had warned it would, but emotional residue remained. I could still feel the restraints around my wrists and ankles, still taste the blood from a split lip, still experience the profound helplessness of having my body subject to other people's decisions. The memory wasn't mine, but the trauma had integrated into my neural architecture in ways that felt permanent. "I need to step outside," I said abruptly. "Get some air, distance from the building." No one objected. Dr. Voss removed my monitoring equipment, checking each sensor's readings before disconnecting it. Marcus printed out a summary of my neural activity patterns, the kind of data that would occupy weeks of analysis. Jennifer provided me with copies of the architectural plans and material specifications on a thumb drive. I walked out through the lobby, through the main entrance with its propped open glass door, into the parking lot where my car waited among the contractor vehicles and Dr. Voss's Mercedes. The desert air was cool with approaching evening, carrying scents of sage and dust, and the particular mineral quality that eastern Washington landscapes possess. I stood there breathing, letting the clean air purge the examination room's lingering impressions from my lungs. The building loomed behind me, 3 stories of concrete and glass holding decades of human experience in its architectural bones. From outside, it looked ordinary. Another abandoned institutional facility slowly succumbing to entropy and desert reclamation. But I knew now what it contained, the memories it held, the experiences it could transmit to anyone sensitive enough to receive them. My phone had signal here in the parking lot, weak but functional. I checked messages, university emails about departmental meetings I'd missed, a text from a colleague asking about my research status, automated notifications from journals and academic mailing lists. Normal life, continuing without my presence, indifferent to the impossible things I'd experienced. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive back to Seattle, to put distance between myself and this place. But I also wanted to stay, to understand, to investigate the phenomenon with the systematic rigor it deserved. The 2 impulses warred within me, fear versus curiosity, self-preservation versus the fundamental researchers need to know. Dr. Voss emerged from the building, approaching with the careful movements of someone unsure of their reception. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I experienced something I shouldn't have been able to experience," I said. "Like the boundaries of what's possible have shifted, and I don't know how to recalibrate my understanding of reality." "That's a common response," he said. "Everyone who experiences the immersive episodes goes through a period of ontological adjustment. What we believe about consciousness, about memory, about the relationship between mind and matter, all of it requires revision in light of what this building demonstrates." "Have you experienced it?" I asked. "The memory insertion?" He nodded. "Once. A staff meeting in 1981 discussing budget cuts and the looming closure. I experienced it from the perspective of the facility director, a man named Harold Brennan. The stress, the bureaucratic pressures, the knowledge that he was overseeing an institution that was failing its patients but unable to find alternatives. It was," he paused, searching for words, "profoundly empathetic." I understood his position in ways I couldn't have from simply reading documents or hearing descriptions. "Harold Brennan," I said, "related to Sarah Brennan, the girl I experienced in the occupational therapy room." "His daughter," Dr. Voss confirmed. "She was admitted to his own facility, which must have been extraordinarily complicated emotionally. The records suggest he tried to maintain professional boundaries, but that her presence created ongoing tension with staff who felt he gave her preferential treatment." The information added layers to Sarah Brennan's memory. She hadn't just been another resident following routines. She'd been the director's daughter, experiencing institutional care while her father oversaw the institution. The complexity of that situation, the emotional weight it must have carried, made the simple memory of craft activities more poignant. "I'll stay," I said. "For the 2 weeks you originally proposed. I want to experience more of the building, map the effects systematically, try to understand the mechanism. But I need better protocols. Gradual exposure rather than immediate immersion in traumatic memories. And I need access to all your previous data, every case study, every neural scan, every architectural detail." "Of course," Dr. Voss said. "Whatever you need. The goal is understanding, not simply documentation. If we can determine how the building functions as a memory medium, it could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, of how subjective experience relates to physical reality." We returned inside, and I spent the rest of the evening reviewing data. The case studies numbered in the dozens. Construction workers, engineers, previous researchers, all experiencing memories that weren't theirs. The consistency was remarkable. Multiple people reporting the same events, the same conversations, the same sensory details, without any possibility of collusion or shared information. One pattern emerged clearly. The more time people spent in the building, the more likely they were to experience memory insertion. Brief exposures, less than 30 minutes, typically produced only sensory impressions. Longer durations increased the probability of full immersive episodes. And the building seemed to have preferences, if that term could apply to architecture. Certain locations were consistently more active than others. Certain memories appeared repeatedly across multiple subjects, while others remained unique to individuals. The trauma memories were overrepresented. Not just the examination room experience I'd had, but others. Restraint episodes, forced medication, isolation as punishment, instances of violence between residents or between residents and staff. The building remembered suffering with remarkable fidelity, playing it back to new occupants with all its original emotional intensity intact. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. One contractor had experienced a memory of two residents falling in love, their secret meetings in a storage closet, the particular excitement and fear of forbidden relationship in an environment that didn't permit sexual expression. Another had experienced a staff member's memory of successfully helping a resident learn to read, the profound satisfaction of witnessing that moment when symbols became meaning. The building contained everything, the full range of human experience that had occurred within its walls over 25 years of operation. Routine and crisis, joy and suffering, the mundane and the extraordinary, all encoded somehow in concrete and steel and glass, waiting to be experienced by anyone who stayed long enough to receive the transmission. I worked until exhaustion forced me to stop. Dr. Voss had arranged accommodation, a motor home parked in the lot, equipped with bed, bathroom, kitchenette. The idea of sleeping near the building made my skin crawl, but driving 3 hours back to Seattle only to return the next day seemed impractical. The motor home was generic and impersonal, which I found comforting after the intensity of the building's memories. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the day's experiences churning through my consciousness. The memories I'd absorbed were fading as predicted, but fragments remained, integrated into my neural architecture in ways I couldn't fully distinguish from my genuine memories. Had I really made autumn decorations for a harvest festival? No, that was Sarah Brennan in 1978. But the memory of the activity felt real, accessible mine. Had I experienced medical assault in an examination room? No, that was Linda Morrison in 1976 or 1977. But the trauma response in my body suggested otherwise. Suggested that some part of me believed the violation had happened to this body, this nervous system, this person lying in a motor home in a desert parking lot in 2025. The boundary between self and other had become permeable. That was the building's fundamental effect. It eroded the distinction between individual consciousness and collective experience, allowing memories to flow across temporal and personal boundaries. Understanding why that should be impossible was my life's work. Understanding how it was nevertheless happening was why I was here. I slept poorly, waking repeatedly from dreams that mixed my actual past with absorbed memories. In one dream, I was simultaneously myself at age 12 and Sarah Brennan at age 19. Existing in 2 times at once, confused about which reality was authentic. In another, I attended a doctoral defense that seamlessly transitioned into a staff meeting about budget cuts, the academic environment overlaying the institutional one, until I couldn't distinguish which was which. Morning came with desert dawn, abrupt transition from darkness to blazing light, no gentle gradual brightening. I washed and dressed in the motor home's cramped bathroom, ate a protein bar and drank coffee from the kitchenette's single-serve maker, and walked back to the building. Dr. Voss was already in the administrative offices, looking as sleep-deprived as I felt. "I've been analyzing your neural data from yesterday," he said. "The patterns are extraordinary. During the examination room experience, your brain showed activity consistent with someone actually undergoing trauma, stress hormone release, amygdala hyperactivation, the whole cascade of physiological trauma responses. Not imagined trauma or remembered trauma, but trauma happening in real time." Because from my brain's perspective, it was happening in real time, I said. The memory wasn't being recalled, it was being re-experienced, reenacted with full sensory and emotional fidelity. My nervous system couldn't distinguish between genuine present experience and transmitted past experience, which raises disturbing questions about the nature of self, Dr. Voss said. If you can fully experience someone else's memories as if they're your own, what does that mean for personal identity? Are we just the accumulated memories we carry? And if memories can be transferred, can identity be transferred too? That's philosophical rather than neuroscientific, I said, but the question troubled me anyway. I'd been trained to think of consciousness as emergent property of neural activity, of identity as continuous narrative constructed from remembered experiences. But if experiences could be separated from the person who originally had them, if memories could exist independent of their original neural substrate and be impressed onto new consciousness, then identity became less stable, more fluid than materialist neuroscience allowed. We spent the morning planning systematic exploration of the building. The goal was to map the effect, identify which locations produced which types of memories, correlate spatial features with memory intensity, build a comprehensive understanding of how the building functioned as experiential medium. The residential units would be surveyed first, as they'd produced relatively benign memories. Then common areas, dining hall, occupational therapy, recreational spaces. Medical facilities would be saved for later, approached with appropriate caution given their traumatic content. And there were areas we hadn't explored yet. The first floor dormitories where lower functioning residents had lived, the basement with its mechanical systems and storage, the roof where records indicated residents sometimes had supervised outdoor time. I want to try shorter exposures, I said, 10 to 15 minutes per location, with breaks between to let neural activity return to baseline. The goal is mapping rather than deep immersion. I don't need to fully inhabit every memory. I just need to identify what's there. Dr. Voss agreed, and we established protocols. Continuous monitoring, regular check-ins, strict time limits, immediate extraction at first sign of severe distress. Marcus and Jennifer would handle the technical aspects while Dr. Voss accompanied me, maintaining verbal contact to help ground me in present reality if I began losing boundaries between self and absorbed memory. We started with the residential units I hadn't yet experienced. Room 2, A12, produced memories of a young man with cerebral palsy, his daily struggles with basic motor control, his frustration with his body's limitations, but also his pride when he accomplished tasks others took for granted. Room 2B06 held memories of an older woman with dementia, her confusion and fear mixed with occasional moments of clarity when she recognized where she was and grieved for the life she'd lost. Each exposure lasted 12 to 15 minutes, enough time to establish the memory's character without full immersion. The experiences were becoming routine, almost procedural. Enter room, sit or lie down. Wait for the sensory shifts that signaled beginning memory transmission. Observe the experience with as much clinical detachment as possible. Exit when time limit reached. But routine didn't make the experiences less powerful. Each memory carried its own emotional weight, its own perspective on institutional life. The building contained multitudes, dozens of individual experiences, each unique, each contributing to a collective portrait of what it meant to be confined here, to have your life subject to institutional control, to navigate the particular challenges of disability or mental illness in an era with limited understanding and fewer resources. By afternoon, I'd experienced fragments of 17 different memories. My neural activity showed cumulative effects. The baseline between exposures wasn't returning completely to my original patterns. Instead, a new baseline was emerging, one that incorporated elements of all the memories I'd absorbed. My brain was adapting to the building's influence, developing protocols for processing transmitted experiences alongside genuine personal memories. "We should stop for today," Dr. Voss said, reviewing my neural data. "The cumulative exposure is significant, and I'm concerned about integration effects. Your brain is showing signs of confusion about memory sourcing, difficulty distinguishing self-generated memories from transmitted ones." "I feel fine," I objected, though I wasn't sure that was true. My sense of personal continuity felt less stable than it had that morning. When I tried to recall my own childhood, fragments of other childhoods intruded, memories of institutional life mixing with memories of my actual suburban upbringing, creating composite experiences that belong to no one. "That's exactly what concerns me," Dr. Voss said. "You feel fine because your brain is normalizing the confusion. But from external observation, you're exhibiting signs of dissociative processing. You need distance from the building, time for your neural architecture to reconsolidate around your genuine memories rather than absorbed ones." Reluctantly, I agreed. We returned to the motor home, where I attempted to rest. But rest was difficult when my memories were in flux, when I couldn't reliably distinguish experiences I'd actually lived through from experiences I'd absorbed from the building's architectural storage. I tried to anchor myself in verifiable reality. I called my department chair, discussed teaching schedules and grant applications, normal academic concerns that belonged unambiguously to my genuine life. I reviewed my own published research, reading papers I'd written, reminding myself of my actual professional history. I looked at photographs on my phone, my own face at various ages, places I'd actually been, people I genuinely knew, using visual evidence to reinforce authentic memory. It helped somewhat. The integration confusion began to resolve as I spent time away from the building's influence. By evening, I could distinguish my genuine memories from absorbed ones with reasonable reliability, though some uncertainty remained at the edges. Dr. Voss joined me for dinner, takeout from a town 40 minutes away, the closest source of prepared food. We ate in the motor home's small dining area, discussing the day's findings and planning the next day's exploration. "The building's effect is cumulative," he said. "The more you experience, the more your brain adapts to processing transmitted memories. Eventually, you might develop the ability to navigate the memories without losing yourself in them, to observe them while maintaining clear boundaries between self and other. But that requires time and careful calibration." "How long did it take previous researchers?" I asked. "The longest anyone has studied the building continuously was 6 weeks, Dr. Voss said. A psychologist named Dr. Amanda Chen. She developed remarkable ability to navigate the memories, to access them almost at will while maintaining clear sense of self. But she also reported lasting effects, difficulty with her own memory afterward, confusion about which experiences were hers. She eventually left the project, said the work was destabilizing in ways she couldn't continue to accept." "Is she still working in the field?" "She opened a private practice in Eugene, specializes in trauma therapy. She's been helpful as a consultant on this project, but she refuses to return to the building itself. The information was sobering. Even someone with 6 weeks of experience and professional training in psychology had found the building's effects too destabilizing to continue. And I was planning to stay 2 weeks, exposing myself repeatedly to experiences that were already challenging my sense of self. But I was also excited in ways I hadn't been about research in years. This building represented something unprecedented, genuine anomaly, phenomenon that shouldn't exist according to established understanding, but demonstrably did. Understanding it could transform not just cognitive neuroscience, but philosophy, metaphysics, our fundamental assumptions about consciousness, and its relationship to physical reality. I want to access the basement tomorrow, I said. The mechanical systems, storage areas, places that wouldn't have been heavily occupied by residents but where staff spent time. See if the effect is limited to patient spaces or if it extends to all areas of the building. Dr. Voss nodded. The basement is interesting. Less reported activity than upper floors, but what activity exists tends to be different in character. More staff memories, more institutional process rather than patient experience. Though there's one area, the old morgue, that we haven't fully explored yet. The building had a morgue. Residential facilities this size typically did. Residents died here, from age, illness, accidents. The bodies would be held temporarily in cold storage until funeral arrangements could be made. It's in the basement's north corner, been sealed since the facility closed. We opened it for initial survey, but haven't had anyone spend significant time there. Why not? Dr. Voss hesitated. The survey team reported extremely negative sensory impressions, overwhelming fear, sadness, a sense of accumulated grief that made the space nearly unbearable. No one's been willing to do extended exposure there. I want to try, I said. Dr. Castellanos. Myra, we've absorbed each other's memories at this point. You might as well use my first name. He smiled slightly. Myra, then, but I strongly advise against the morgue as an early exposure site. The emotional intensity of the memories there appears to be extreme. You should develop more experience navigating the building's effects before attempting spaces that traumatic. Noted and dismissed, I said. The traumatic spaces are the most interesting scientifically. Death, grief, loss. Those are the experiences that create the deepest impressions. If we want to understand how the building functions as memory medium, we need to examine its most extreme examples. We argued about it through dinner and into the evening, but ultimately Dr. Voss conceded. I was the expert consultant. He was the project director, but I had final authority over my own exposure decisions. He could advise, could establish safety protocols, but he couldn't prevent me from accessing any part of the building I chose to explore. That night, I dreamed of the morgue, though I hadn't seen it yet. Cold rooms with metal tables, bodies covered with sheets, grief that permeated walls and floor and ceiling until the space itself mourned. I woke gasping, uncertain if the dream was prescient anxiety, or if I'd somehow absorbed impressions of the space through the building's ambient influence, memory transmission occurring even during sleep. Morning came too quickly. I was exhausted, neural activity elevated even before entering the building, stress hormones circulating in my blood from accumulated exposure and disturbed sleep. Every professional instinct I possessed insisted I should rest, should allow my system to recover before attempting more difficult spaces. But curiosity drove me forward. I entered the building with Dr. Voss and his team, descended the stairs past the second floor where I'd experienced so many memories, continued down to the first floor, and then to the basement level beyond. The basement was different from the upper floors. Concrete rather than tile, exposed pipes and ductwork, industrial lighting that cast harsh shadows and left corners in darkness. The temperature was cooler here, below ground level, insulated from desert heat but also from solar warmth. The air smelled of machinery and old damp and something else, something that might have been decay, or might have been my imagination anticipating what I'd find. The morgue occupied the north corner, accessed through a corridor lined with storage rooms and mechanical equipment. The door was heavy metal, industrial grade, with a locking mechanism that had probably been designed to prevent unauthorized access. Dr. Voss had the key, had obviously been here before, but his reluctance was visible in his slow movements, his hesitation before turning the key in the lock. "We can still choose a different location," he said. "There are plenty of other basement spaces to explore first." "Open the door," I said. The lock disengaged with a heavy mechanical click. Dr. Voss pulled the door open, revealing darkness beyond. He found a light switch and fluorescent fixtures flickered to life, illuminating a space that was exactly what I dreamed but worse, because now it was real. The morgue was perhaps 20 feet by 30, with concrete walls painted institutional green that had faded to gray-green. 4 metal tables occupied the center of the space, their surfaces stainless steel, their legs equipped with wheels for mobility. Along one wall were what had been refrigeration units, large metal doors set into the wall, each with a handle and a small window. The refrigeration was no longer functional, but the doors remained, silent testimony to the space's original purpose. The emotional weight was immediate and overwhelming. Not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. Primarily grief, an accumulated sadness so profound that it seemed to have mass, to press down like physical weight on anyone entering the space. My chest tightened, my breathing became labored, tears formed in my eyes without conscious sadness triggering them. "The sensory response is extremely strong," Marcus said, monitoring my neural activity from the doorway. "Amygdala activation, elevated cortisol, patterns consistent with acute grief reaction. And you've only been in here 30 seconds. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. The grief was so intense it felt like drowning, like being submerged in an ocean of accumulated loss. How many deaths had this room witnessed? How many bodies had lain on these metal tables? How many family members had stood here identifying loved ones, saying final goodbyes, confronting the mortality that institutional life had briefly obscured? I moved to one of the refrigeration units and opened the door. The space beyond was empty, a metal chamber perhaps 7 feet deep and 3 feet high, designed to hold a body on a sliding tray that was no longer present. Cold emanated from the space, despite the refrigeration being non-functional. Not physical cold, but psychological cold. The chill that death brings to every space it occupies. I closed the door and turned to the metal tables. They were clean, polished despite decades of disuse, as if someone had recently prepared them for use. I knew that was impossible. The building had been abandoned for 30 years, but the tables gleamed as if awaiting their next patient. I sat on one of the tables because that seemed appropriate, because that's where bodies had lain. The metal was cold even through my clothes, conducting heat away from my body. I lay back, positioning myself as a body would be positioned, straight, arms at my sides, feet together. The memory took me immediately. No gradual transition, no warning. One moment I was Myra Castellanos lying on a morgue table in 2025. The next I was dead. Not experiencing someone else's death, actually dead. Consciousness reduced to whatever remains when biological function ceases. I couldn't breathe because dead lungs don't breathe. Couldn't move because dead muscles don't respond to neural signals. Couldn't see because dead eyes don't process light. I was trapped in a body that was no longer alive, experiencing death from the inside, unable to escape or scream or signal distress. The terror was absolute and primal. This was the fundamental human fear, not pain or suffering but cessation, the end of subjective experience, the transition from being to not being. I was experiencing it while still conscious, which should have been impossible, which was impossible, but was nevertheless happening. Time distorted. Seconds felt like hours, each moment of non-being stretching toward infinity. I was aware of voices above me, staff members I somehow knew, preparing my body for temporary storage. Their voices were distant, muffled, filtered through dead ears that couldn't quite process sound. They were talking about lunch plans, discussing a television show, treating my body with the casual indifference that comes from frequent exposure to death. Someone pulled a sheet over my face, blocking even the dim light that dead eyes couldn't properly see. The sheet was rough fabric, institutional quality, carrying the smell of industrial detergent. Darkness became complete. Isolation became total. I was alone with my death, with the absence where my consciousness had been. Then movement, my body being lifted, transferred from table to gurney, wheeled across the morgue floor with mechanical efficiency. The refrigeration unit door opened, and cold air spilled over my dead skin. Hands guided the gurney into the refrigerated chamber. The door closed with a heavy thunk, and I was sealed in darkness and cold and death. The experience should have ended there. Dead consciousness doesn't continue. But the memory persisted, time passing in that locked chamber, hours or days impossible to measure without external reference. The grief I felt wasn't my own, but belonged to family members I somehow knew existed, people who loved the person I'd been before death, who would mourn my loss when they learned of it. I tried to activate the emergency beacon, but my hands wouldn't move. Dead hands. I tried to scream, but dead lungs produced no sound. I was trapped in the memory of death, experiencing it with full consciousness, unable to escape or signal or do anything except endure the fundamental horror of non-being while still somehow being aware. Then hands on my body again, pulling me from the refrigerated chamber, removing the sheet from my face. Light returned, painful even to dead eyes. Voices discussing arrangements, funeral home transport, documentation that needed completion. The body, my body, was being processed according to institutional protocol. Death reduced to paperwork and logistics. The transition back to life was violent and disorienting. Suddenly I could breathe, gasping for air like someone surfacing from deep water. I could move, my body responding to neural commands, alive and functional. I rolled off the morgue table onto the floor, retching though my stomach was empty, my entire system in crisis from the extended death experience. Dr. Voss was there immediately, pulling me away from the table out of the morgue, into the corridor where air felt less dense with accumulated grief. I couldn't speak, couldn't explain. could only shake and gasp and try to convince my biology that I was actually alive despite having just experienced extended death. How long? I managed finally. 90 seconds, Jennifer said from where she stood in the morgue doorway, clearly reluctant to enter the space. From the moment you lay down until you rolled off the table, the neural patterns were, she stopped, apparently unable to find words. I was dead, I said. I experienced death, extended death, hours or days of being dead, trapped in a body that wasn't functioning, conscious of my own non-being. 90 seconds. Subjectively longer, Dr. Voss said. Extreme time dilation, more pronounced than any previous case we've documented. Your neural activity showed patterns we've never seen before. Consciousness persisting in the absence of expected biochemical support, as if your brain was maintaining awareness through sheer momentum, even though it should have shut down completely. Whose memory was it? I asked. Marcus consulted his tablet, pulling up archived records. Based on the timeline you described and the specific details of the morgue procedure, probably Margaret Sullivan. Died of heart failure in October 1982 at age 63. She'd been a long-term resident, nearly 15 years. Records indicate her death was expected. Her heart condition had been deteriorating for months. But there were delays in notifying her next of kin, and her body remained in cold storage for nearly 5 days before funeral arrangements were completed. Margaret Sullivan, the woman Patricia had mentioned in my occupational therapy memory, the one who powered herself with spite, too mean to die until she wasn't. I'd experienced her death, those days of cold storage while institutional bureaucracy slowly processed her departure from the system. I can't do this anymore today, I said. I need to be somewhere else, anywhere else. No one objected. Dr. Voss helped me stand, supported me as we walked through the basement corridor, up the stairs, through the building's levels, out into the parking lot where sunlight and fresh air felt like miracles of sensory grace. I stood there breathing, reminding myself that breath was possible, that consciousness continued, that death was not my current state despite what the memory had convinced me I was experiencing. The research team gave me space, watching from a distance, monitoring my neural activity remotely. I paced the parking lot, forcing my legs to move, confirming that my body responded to my commands. Alive, functional, not dead on a morgue table in 1982. But the memory lingered, integrated into my neural architecture with frightening completeness. I could still feel the cold of refrigerated storage, still sense the weight of the sheet over my face, still experience the fundamental wrongness of consciousness persisting in a non-functioning body. The memory was fading. All the absorbed memories faded eventually. But this one felt different, more permanent, as if experiencing death had changed something fundamental about my relationship with mortality. Hours passed before I felt stable enough to continue working. We returned to the administrative offices, where I reviewed my neural data from the morgue experience. The patterns were extraordinary and disturbing. During the death memory, my brain had shown activity consistent with someone in a dissociative state, consciousness maintained but disconnected from normal sensory processing and bodily awareness. The patterns resembled deep meditation or certain types of anesthetic states, where awareness continues but attachment to physical embodiment diminishes. The building doesn't just record memories, I said, studying the data. It records states of consciousness, including altered states, trauma states, even states associated with dying. The architectural medium doesn't distinguish between normal consciousness and extreme experiences. It captures everything and plays it all back with equal fidelity, which means the building is more than a passive recording medium, Dr. Voss said. It's actively preserving and transmitting states of consciousness that shouldn't be preservable. Consciousness requires active biological processes, neural firing, neurotransmitter dynamics, the whole cascade of biochemical activity that supports subjective experience. Dead brains don't generate consciousness. Yet Margaret Sullivan's consciousness persisted somehow, preserved in the building's structure, available to be experienced decades after her biological death. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If consciousness could be preserved in architecture, if subjective experience could exist independent of biological substrate, then everything materialist neuroscience assumed about the mind-brain relationship required fundamental revision. Consciousness wasn't simply an emergent property of neural activity. It was something that could be impressed onto physical structure, stored and transmitted like information on a hard drive. We need to analyze those unusual architectural features more thoroughly, I said. The acoustic dampening compound, the metal mesh in the floors, the ceiling cavities. If the building is functioning as a consciousness storage medium, those elements are probably crucial to the mechanism. Dr. Voss had already been working on this. He'd sent samples of the acoustic compound to a materials science lab, requested detailed analysis of the metal mesh patterns, arranged for architectural engineers to examine the ceiling cavity design. Results were expected within days, though the labs he'd chosen were puzzled by what they were being asked to analyze, and why we spent the rest of the day reviewing existing data, looking for patterns we'd missed. The building's effect wasn't random. Certain locations produced certain types of memories with reliable consistency. The residential units generally yielded routine daily experiences. Common areas produced social interactions and therapeutic activities. Medical spaces held trauma and treatment memories. And the morgue was unique, the only location that consistently transmitted consciousness states associated with death and dying. But there were anomalies. One storage closet on the second floor had produced intensely joyful memories of the secret relationship between two residents who'd used the space for stolen moments of intimacy and connection. Another seemingly innocuous hallway junction near the administrative offices generated memories of profound anxiety, staff members making difficult decisions about patient care under bureaucratic constraints. The building had its own geography of consciousness, with emotional hotspots and dead zones, areas of intense memory density and regions that remained mysteriously neutral despite heavy use. Understanding the pattern might reveal something about the mechanism. By evening, I was mentally exhausted despite having experienced only one memory immersion. The death experience had taken a toll that extended beyond simple fatigue. I felt existentially unsettled, my sense of self and continuity shaken by having experienced cessation while remaining aware. I returned to the motor home as the desert twilight painted the sky in layers of orange and purple. Inside, I tried to ground myself in normal activities, showering, preparing a simple meal, checking email. But every mundane action felt precious and miraculous in ways it hadn't before. The sensation of hot water on skin, the taste of food, the simple act of breathing, all of it felt like gifts, temporary privileges that could be revoked at any moment. My phone rang. The caller ID showed my department chair, Professor Elizabeth Hartley. I answered, grateful for connection to my normal life. Myra, she said, her voice carrying the particular concern of someone who's noticed an absence. I haven't heard from you in several days. How's the consulting project going? I paused, trying to find words that would be both truthful and comprehensible. It's more complex than I expected. The phenomenon I'm investigating is legitimate but difficult to explain within conventional neuroscience frameworks. That sounds ominous. Are you all right? You sound stressed. I'm fine, I lied. Just working long hours and dealing with some challenging data. We talked for 20 minutes about departmental politics, teaching schedules, grant applications, the ordinary concerns of academic life that felt absurdly distant from what I was experiencing. When we finished, I felt more connected to my genuine self, my actual professional identity, the person I'd been before entering this building and its accumulated consciousness. That night I slept better, exhaustion overcoming the anxiety that had plagued previous nights. My dreams were quieter, less fragmented, though still mixed genuine memories with absorbed ones. I dreamed of my graduate school years, but the setting kept shifting to institutional hallways and residential units, my actual past overlaying spaces from the building's memory. Morning brought new determination. I'd experienced the extremes, the trauma of medical assault, the horror of death. If I could survive those, I could navigate the building's other memories with appropriate preparation and boundaries. The key was maintaining connection to my genuine self, not allowing the absorbed memories to fully subsume my identity. We spent the morning exploring the first floor, where the dormitory-style housing for lower-functioning residents had been located. These spaces had housed people with more severe disabilities, individuals who required constant supervision and assistance with basic activities of daily living. The dormitories were large open rooms, each with 10 to 12 beds arranged in rows. Privacy had been minimal. Curtains between beds provided only visual separation, no actual isolation. Bathrooms were communal, showers and toilets in a row without stalls. The architectural philosophy of the era had prioritized efficient supervision over dignity, creating spaces that treated residents as patients to be managed rather than individuals deserving privacy. I sat on one of the empty bed frames, preparing for whatever memory the space would transmit. The experience came quickly. Routine morning activities, staff members helping residents dress and perform basic hygiene, the particular chaos of trying to manage 12 people with varying levels of cognitive function and physical ability through breakfast preparation and medication distribution. But what struck me most was the tenderness. Despite the institutional setting, despite the lack of privacy and the efficiency-focused routines, the staff member whose memory I inhabited genuinely cared about the residents. She knew their individual preferences, who liked their toast darker, who needed gentle coaxing to take medications, who responded better to humor versus firm instruction. She saw them as people, not simply patients, and her care extended beyond mere procedural completion to actual human connection. The memory lasted about 20 minutes subjectively, perhaps 8 minutes in real time. When it ended, I felt oddly uplifted despite the institutional setting. Not all the building's memories were traumatic. Some captured moments of genuine care, authentic human connection despite, or perhaps because of, the difficult circumstances. We continued through the first floor, experiencing fragments of memories from different staff members, different residents, different periods of the facility's operation. I began to develop a sense of the building's history, the evolution of care philosophies and treatment approaches across its 25 years of operation. The early years had been more optimistic, staff members believing they were providing progressive care in a modern facility. Later years showed increasing strain, budget cuts, staffing shortages, the growing recognition that institutional care was failing to achieve its promised outcomes. By afternoon, I'd experienced portions of 23 different memories. My neural activity showed continued adaptation. I was developing the ability Dr. Voss had mentioned, learning to navigate absorbed memories while maintaining stronger boundaries between self and other. The experiences were becoming less overwhelming, more manageable, though still emotionally intense. "You're developing facility with the building's effects," Dr. Voss observed, reviewing my data. "Your brain is learning to process transmitted consciousness without fully merging with it. It's similar to what Dr. Chen achieved during her extended research period, though you're progressing more quickly." "Maybe because I'm approaching it systematically," I suggested, treating each exposure as data collection rather than fully surrendering to the experience, maintaining analytical distance even while experiencing emotional content. "Or maybe you're simply more suited to this particular kind of consciousness work," Dr. Voss said. "Your research has always focused on the boundary between genuine and false memory, between experienced reality and constructed narrative. This building is making you live that research question in the most literal way possible." He was right. My entire career had prepared me for this, understanding how the brain constructs memory, how subjective experience can be divorced from objective reality, how consciousness can be fooled into believing false things. The building was the ultimate expression of those research questions, forcing me to experience them directly rather than study them abstractly. That evening, the materials analysis results arrived. Dr. Voss called me to the administrative offices where he'd set up a video conference with Dr. Sarah Kim, the materials scientist who'd analyzed the acoustic compound samples. Dr. Kim appeared on screen, a woman in her 40s with puzzled expression that suggested the results had confused her. "Dr. Voss, I've completed the analysis, but I'm not sure what to make of it. The compound you sent me is unlike anything in standard building materials databases." "Can you describe its composition?" Dr. Voss asked. "It's primarily a polymer matrix with embedded crystalline structures," Dr. Kim explained. "The crystals are unusual. They're piezoelectric materials, substances that generate electric charge in response to mechanical stress. But they're arranged in patterns that don't serve any obvious structural purpose. Instead, they form networks that look almost like circuit boards, with the crystalline elements positioned to create complex electromagnetic interactions." "What would be the practical effect of such a structure?" I asked. Dr. Kim pulled up images on her screen, showing microscopic views of the compound's internal structure. "In theory, this material could interact with electromagnetic fields in sophisticated ways. The piezoelectric crystals would respond to mechanical vibrations, sound waves, physical impacts, any kind of pressure, by generating small electric charges. Those charges would propagate through the crystal network, creating complex electromagnetic patterns." "Could those patterns encode information?" Dr. Voss asked. "Potentially, yes. The crystal network has enough complexity to store significant amounts of data. It's similar in principle to how computer memory works, though using completely different mechanisms." If electromagnetic patterns were impressed onto this material repeatedly, under the right conditions, it might retain those patterns, like a magnetic tape recording sound, but recording electromagnetic signatures instead. Dr. Voss and I exchanged glances. Human neural activity generates electromagnetic fields, I said. Thoughts, memories, consciousness, they're all accompanied by electrical patterns in the brain. If this compound can record electromagnetic patterns, then it might be recording neural activity, Dr. Voss finished. The building's walls, floors, and ceilings contain this compound. Decades of human neural activity occurring within these spaces, electromagnetic patterns from hundreds of brains engaged in thinking, remembering, feeling, all of it potentially impressed onto the piezoelectric crystal networks. Dr. Kim looked alarmed. That's highly speculative. The electromagnetic fields generated by neural activity are extremely weak. The compound would need to be extraordinarily sensitive to record them, and the mechanisms for playback would be even more complex. You'd need some kind of resonance effect, where new neural activity entering the space triggers the stored patterns to discharge, creating feedback loops that... She stopped, apparently realizing the implications of what she was describing. That's exactly what we're observing, Dr. Voss said quietly. People entering spaces within this building and experiencing memories that aren't theirs. Their own neural activity appears to trigger the recorded patterns, creating consciousness experiences that correspond to events that occurred decades ago. Dr. Kim was silent for a long moment. That shouldn't be possible. The human brain isn't a receiver. It generates its own patterns. It doesn't passively accept external electromagnetic input and translate it into conscious experience. Under normal circumstances, no, I said. But if the electromagnetic patterns are strong enough, and if they resonate with the natural frequencies of neural oscillations, they might be able to entrain brain activity, force the neural patterns to synchronize with the recorded ones. It would be similar to how external rhythmic stimulation can entrain brain waves. The building is essentially broadcasting recorded consciousness, and susceptible brains are tuning into that broadcast. The theoretical framework was coming together. The building's unusual materials created a medium for recording electromagnetic patterns associated with human consciousness. Decades of neural activity had impressed those patterns into the crystalline networks embedded in walls, floors, and ceilings. When new people entered the spaces, their own brain activity interacted with the recorded patterns, creating resonance effects that translated stored electromagnetic signatures back into subjective conscious experience. It was insane. It violated fundamental principles of how consciousness and memory worked. But it also explained everything we'd observed: the consistency of transmitted memories, their emotional intensity, the neural patterns showing genuine experience rather than imagination or confabulation. I need more analysis, Dr. Kim said. Samples of the metal mesh, the ceiling cavity materials. If this hypothesis is correct, those components are probably part of the system, maybe amplifying signals or creating standing wave patterns that enhance the recording and playback effects. I'll send everything you need, Dr. Voss promised. But I need you to maintain absolute confidentiality. What we're dealing with here is unprecedented. If this information becomes public before we understand it fully... I understand, Dr. Kim said. But Dr. Voss, if this is real, if architecture can genuinely record and transmit human consciousness, the implications extend far beyond this single building. How many other structures might have similar properties? How many places might be preserving consciousness without anyone realizing it? The question hung in the air after the conference ended. If this building could record consciousness, could others? The piezoelectric compound wasn't standard in 1968 construction, but it wasn't unique to this facility either. Resonance Design Associates had built dozens of institutional facilities across the western states. Were they all consciousness recording devices? And what about other buildings with unusual materials or electromagnetic properties? Might consciousness preservation be more widespread than we'd imagine, occurring anywhere the right conditions existed? We need to find other buildings designed by Resonance Design Associates, I said. Test whether they exhibit similar effects. If this is reproducible, if it's a property of the architectural design rather than something unique to this specific location, then we've discovered something fundamental about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, Dr. Voss finished. Not just an anomaly to be studied, but a general principle that's been operating undetected for decades. He pulled up records of Resonance Design Associates' other projects. The firm had designed 11 institutional facilities between 1965 and 1982. Psychiatric hospitals, facilities for developmental disabilities, nursing homes. Most had been closed during the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1980s and 90s. Several had been demolished, but 4 remained standing, though abandoned or repurposed. We should visit them, I said. Set up brief surveys, see if they produce similar effects. If even one other building shows consciousness transmission properties, it would support the hypothesis that this is architectural rather than anomalous. Dr. Voss nodded slowly. That would require expanding the project significantly. More funding, more personnel, more time. But you're right, we need to determine if this is reproducible. I'll reach out to Meridian's leadership, propose an expansion of the research scope. We spent the rest of the evening planning the expanded investigation. I felt energized despite my exhaustion, excited by the prospect of systematic research into a phenomenon that was revealing itself to be potentially widespread rather than isolated. This was real science, not just documentation of an anomaly but investigation of underlying principles. That night, lying in the motor home, I reviewed everything I'd learned. The building used piezoelectric materials to record electromagnetic patterns associated with human consciousness. Extended exposure to those patterns caused visitors' brains to synchronize with them, recreating the subjective experiences of people long gone. The effect was consistent, reproducible, and appeared to be an emergent property of specific architectural design rather than supernatural phenomenon. But questions remain. Why were traumatic memories so much more persistent than routine ones? Was it simply that trauma generated stronger electromagnetic patterns? Or was there something about the architecture that preferentially amplified emotional extremes? Why did some people experience the effect more readily than others? Was it genetic variation in brain electromagnetic properties, or psychological factors like suggestibility and openness to unusual experiences? And the biggest question, what happened to consciousness after biological death? Margaret Sullivan's death experience had shown consciousness persisting in the absence of metabolic activity. Was that simply the building's recording of her final conscious moments, played back with the usual mechanism? Or had the building somehow preserved her actual consciousness, capturing the subjective experience of dying and holding it in architectural storage? I didn't have answers, but I had research directions. That was enough. Science progressed through systematic investigation of well-framed questions, not through immediate revelation. I could be patient. I could do the work. Days blurred together as I continued mapping the building's consciousness geography. I experienced fragments of dozens more memories, staff meetings, therapy sessions, recreational activities, moments of crisis and calm. Each experience added to my understanding of the facility's history, the people who had lived and worked here, the complex web of human relationships and institutional pressures that had shaped daily life. The memories were integrating into my neural architecture in ways that became increasingly sophisticated. I could distinguish my genuine memories from absorbed ones with greater reliability. But I was also developing a kind of dual consciousness, aware of both my own life history and the collected experiences of the building's former inhabitants. It was like having an expanded autobiography, a personal history that extended beyond my actual lived experience to include fragments of dozens of other lives. Dr. Voss monitored my neural activity with growing fascination and concern. "You're developing a form of composite consciousness," he said. "Your brain is treating the absorbed memories not as foreign intrusions, but as legitimate parts of your experiential database. You're becoming a repository for the building's collected consciousness." "Is that dangerous?" I asked. "I don't know. You're further into this than any previous researcher. Dr. Chen developed some composite consciousness after 6 weeks, but her integration wasn't as complete as yours. You're at 10 days and already showing patterns that suggest permanent incorporation of absorbed experiences." "But I still know who I am," I said. "I can distinguish Myra Castellanos from Sarah Brennan or Margaret Sullivan or any of the others. My identity remains coherent." "For now," Dr. Voss said. "But what happens after 2 weeks? After a month? How much consciousness can one brain incorporate before the boundaries dissolve completely?" I didn't have an answer, but I also wasn't afraid. The composite consciousness felt like expansion rather than fragmentation, like my awareness had grown to encompass more than single lifetime could contain. I was still myself, but I was also something more, a vessel for the building's accumulated experience, a living archive of decades of human consciousness. The materials analysis continued to yield results. The metal mesh in the floors created what Dr. Kim called ground planes that stabilized and amplified electromagnetic patterns. The ceiling cavities contained what appeared to be resonant chambers, architectural features that enhanced specific frequencies corresponding to human brain wave patterns. The entire building was essentially a sophisticated consciousness recording device, engineered, perhaps intentionally, perhaps accidentally, to capture and preserve human neural activity. "We need to find the architect," I said. "Whoever designed this for Resonance Design Associates. They must have understood what they were creating, at least partially. You don't accidentally engineer a consciousness recording medium this sophisticated." Dr. Voss had been researching this. The principal architect was named Theodore Vance. He died in 1982, but his notebooks and papers were donated to the architecture school at UC Berkeley. I've requested access. If he understood what he was building, there might be documentation. "What killed him?" I asked. "Suicide," Dr. Voss said quietly. "He jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge. Records suggest he'd been suffering from severe depression and what his family described as disturbing visions." Reading between the lines, I suspect he was experiencing effects similar to what you're experiencing. Composite consciousness from visiting his own buildings, absorbing the memories they contained. The information was chilling. Theodore Vance had created buildings that recorded consciousness, then been destroyed by his own creation's effects. Had he understood what he was doing? Had he built these facilities intentionally to preserve human experience? Or had the consciousness recording properties been an unexpected consequence of his architectural innovations? When do we get access to his papers? I asked. Next week. I'm flying to Berkeley to review them personally. You should come with me. Your expertise in memory and consciousness might help interpret whatever documentation exists. I agreed, though the prospect of leaving the building felt strange. I'd been here 11 days, and the facility had become familiar in ways that transcended simple habituation. I knew its hallways, its rooms, its accumulated memories. I belonged here in a way I'd never belonged anywhere else. My consciousness woven into its architecture just as its architecture had woven into my consciousness. But there was work to be done beyond this single building. Other facilities to investigate, other architects' intentions to understand, broader principles to discover. Science required looking beyond individual cases to general patterns. I couldn't stay here forever, absorbed in one building's memories. I needed to expand my investigation, to understand the phenomenon in its larger context. My final days at the facility were spent in systematic documentation. I created maps of the consciousness geography, marking locations by intensity and content type. I recorded detailed descriptions of every memory I'd experienced, creating an archive that might help future researchers understand what the building contained. I worked with Marcus and Jennifer to analyze my neural data, looking for patterns that might predict who would be susceptible to the building's effects and under what conditions. Dr. Voss arranged for me to meet with Dr. Amanda Chen by video conference. She appeared on screen from her office in Eugene, a woman in her late 40s with warm expression but guarded eyes, the look of someone who'd been deeply affected by experiences she didn't fully understand. Dr. Castellanos, she said, Raymond tells me you've been experiencing the building for nearly 2 weeks. How are you managing? I feel like I'm carrying other people's lives inside my head, I said honestly, but not in a way that feels intrusive or overwhelming, more like expansion, like my consciousness has grown larger to accommodate more experience. Dr. Chen nodded. That's how it started for me too. The composite consciousness feels positive at first, like you're accessing wisdom and experience beyond your years, but it becomes destabilizing over time. You start questioning which experiences are genuinely yours, which decisions were made by you versus influenced by absorbed memories. Your sense of autonomous self begins to erode. Did it resolve after you left? I asked. Partially. The absorbed memories faded over about 6 months, though fragments remained. But the experience changed how I think about identity and consciousness. I used to believe we were discrete individuals with clearly bounded selves. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe consciousness is more fluid than we acknowledge. Maybe we're all composite beings incorporating influences from everyone we encounter. The building just makes that process explicit and extreme. We talked for an hour about her experiences, her observations, the lasting effects of extended exposure. Her warnings were serious but not prohibitive. The building's effects were profound but not necessarily pathological. Consciousness could be expanded, Identity could be fluid without destroying psychological function or well-being. After the conversation, I felt more confident about my decision to continue the research. Yes, there were risks. Yes, the building was changing me in fundamental ways. But the changes weren't damage. They were transformation, evolution, a way of experiencing consciousness that extended beyond typical human limitations. On my final evening at the facility, I walked through the building alone. No monitoring equipment, no research protocols, just me and the accumulated consciousness of decades of human experience. I visited the rooms where I'd experienced the most significant memories. The dining hall where I'd been Rebecca Marsh, the occupational therapy room where I'd been Sarah Brennan, the examination room where I'd been Linda Morrison, the morgue where I'd been Margaret Sullivan dying and dead. Each location held its memories still, ready to transmit to anyone receptive. But I didn't let myself slip into immersion. Instead, I simply acknowledged them, honored them, recognized that these spaces held something precious. The preserved consciousness of people who'd lived, suffered, found moments of joy, and eventually died or moved on. The building was a memorial, whether Theodore Vance had intended it that way or not. A memorial built not of stone, but of recorded consciousness, preserving experience itself rather than merely commemorating it. I understood now why I'd been drawn to this research, why the building's effects resonated so deeply with my work on memory and identity. My entire career had been asking, what makes us who we are? What is the relationship between experience and self? If memories can be false yet neurologically genuine, what does that mean for identity? The building answered those questions in the most radical way possible. Consciousness is not bounded by individual biology. Experience can be preserved, transmitted, shared across time and between people. Identity is not fixed but fluid, capable of expanding to incorporate others' lives and memories. We are not discrete, isolated cells, but nodes in a larger network of consciousness, capable of merging and separating, of carrying each other's experiences forward through time. Tomorrow I would leave for Berkeley, would investigate Theodore Vance's papers, would expand the research to other facilities. But tonight, I stood in a building that had become home in ways that transcended mere physical presence. I belonged here not because I'd lived here, but because I'd experienced decades of other people's lives within these walls. I carried their memories, their joys and sorrows, their routine days and traumatic moments. I was their witness, their vessel, their continuation beyond death and displacement. The building was quiet around me, waiting, always waiting, for the next researcher, the next curious soul willing to let architectural memory flow into biological consciousness. The memories would persist whether anyone experienced them or not, preserved in piezoelectric crystals and electromagnetic resonance, held in walls and floors and ceilings that had recorded everything and forgot nothing. I walked out into the parking lot, into the desert night where stars blazed in darkness undiminished by urban light. Behind me, the building stood silent and patient, its windows dark, its doors closed, its accumulated consciousness waiting in the darkness for whoever would come next to experience what it had preserved. I was changed, fundamentally, irrevocably changed. I carried dozens of lives inside my neural architecture now, fragments of consciousness that had been impressed onto mine through the building's extraordinary mechanism. I would never again believe that identity was singular, that consciousness was bounded, that death was simple cessation. The building had taught me otherwise, had shown me that consciousness persists, that experience can be preserved and transmitted, that we are all more connected than materialist science had ever acknowledged. What I'd learned here would transform not just my research, but my entire understanding of what it means to be human, to be conscious, to be alive. Tomorrow would bring new investigations, new questions, new buildings to explore. But tonight, I stood between the facility and the desert sky, between past consciousness and future discovery, between who I had been and who I was becoming. The memories were already fading, as Dr. Voss had warned they would. By tomorrow, I wouldn't remember the exact smell of the dining hall or the precise feel of restraints in the examination room. The specific details would blur and dissolve, leaving only emotional impressions and general narrative. But something would remain, some fundamental alteration in how my consciousness processed experience, how my brain understood the relationship between self and other, present and past, individual and collective. The building had rewritten something essential in my neural architecture, and that rewriting would persist long after the specific memories had faded. I got in my car, started the engine, but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, I sat there looking at the building one final time. 3 stories of concrete and glass that contained infinitely more than its physical dimensions suggested. A repository of human consciousness, a memorial built of preserved experience, a window into the fluid, expandable, fundamentally mysterious nature of what we call self. Eventually, I put the car in gear and drove away, the building receding in my rearview mirror until distance and darkness consumed it. But I knew I would return. Not immediately, but eventually. Because the building was part of me now, its memories woven into my neural architecture, its accumulated consciousness incorporated into my own. I was no longer simply Myra Castellanos, cognitive neuroscientist investigating memory formation. I was also Sarah Brennan making autumn decorations, Rebecca Marsh standing in line for dinner, Linda Morrison enduring institutional violation, Margaret Sullivan experiencing death's cold persistence. I was all of them, and they were all me. The boundaries had dissolved, the borders between individual consciousness rendered permeable by architecture that remembered everything, and shared that remembering with anyone willing to receive it. The desert highway stretched ahead, leading back towards Seattle and the life I'd left behind 11 days ago. But I knew that life would never fit quite right again, that the person returning was not the person who had left. The building had changed me, expanded me, shown me possibilities for consciousness that conventional neuroscience insisted were impossible. Behind me, in the darkness, the building waited, patient and eternal, its memories preserved in crystalline networks and electromagnetic patterns, ready to transmit its accumulated consciousness to the next person brave or curious or desperate enough to enter its halls and let its past flow into their present. I drove on through the night, carrying dozens of lives within me, my singular consciousness transformed into something plural and strange, and infinitely more vast than I'd imagined consciousness could be. The research would continue. The investigation would expand. But I would never again believe that I was only myself, only Myra, only one continuous identity moving through linear time. The building had taught me otherwise, had shown me that we are all repositories for more than our own experiences, all vessels capable of containing multitudes, all nodes in a larger network of consciousness that transcends individual biology and persists beyond personal death. And somewhere in the high desert, 3 stories of concrete and glass continued its patient waiting, preserving its memories, ready to teach the same impossible lessons to whoever entered next.